Long before any crown had been forged or any city imagined its skyline, the world hummed with a music that had no name, a pattern of purpose woven into the silence. The gods moved like currents in this music, each one carrying a cause, an answer, and a question, and through them the threads of destiny began to braid. From that weaving came stories that would one day be told aloud at hearths and under temple eaves, and among those stories was the one that would become the Ramayana. It began small, as all great things do, in the hush between intention and fulfillment, where choices gather like seeds in a field. The Ramayana was born from a quiet spark, the same spark that lives in all stories. Subscribe and share in the comments if what moves you most is the calm before the story begins or the fire when it finally takes shape. If you listen closely to how myths take shape, you will hear two rhythms, the rhythm of cosmic design and the rhythm of human will. The first is vast and patient, a slow drumbeat from the realm of gods, sages, and eternal law. The second is immediate and earthy, the quick footsteps of kings, mothers, and wanderers making their way through the ordinary world. The Ramayana lives in the meeting of those beats, where divine arrangements and human decisions lock together, creating a narrative that feels both inevitable and heartbreakingly fragile. The gods in the heavens have their reasons, and those reasons often unfold in counsels and whispers. Once, after long cycles of righteousness and decline, the balance of Dharma leaned toward disorder, and the Supreme Protector, Vishnu, considered the forms he might take to restore harmony. His thought was not whimsical, but purposeful, informed by the needs of the world and the call of sages whose prayers can open windows between heaven and earth. The idea of incarnation is a weighty one. It involves relinquishing aspects of the divine home in favor of a mortal stage where action must be enacted and example must be set. Incarnation in this tradition is never arbitrary. It answers a pattern of need, amplified by prayer and by the echoes of past deeds. There were many voices petitioning the protector, devas who feared their waning light, sages who sought models of ideal conduct, and even the earth itself, burdened by suffering and asking for relief. In this confluence of pleas and possibilities, an avatar would be chosen, a being who could embody the virtues required to reorient the world toward balance. Thus the idea of Rama, a form of Vishnu, began as a possibility in the mind of the cosmos. But before Rama could step into the field of human action, the stage had to be set with bloodlines, vows, and royal houses. Those human threads matter because destiny often travels through family, honoring promises made by ancestors and answering curses or boons spoken in other lifetimes. The house of Ikshvaku, an ancient royal line, was one such channel. It was a lineage known for kings who embodied the rule of Dharma, and from that wellspring a child would be born whose life would ripple far beyond the palace walls. King Dashratha sat upon that throne, a ruler whose name itself evokes an image of many chariots and many journeys. His life was marked by the responsibilities of kingship and the ache of an unfulfilled desire, for he had no heir to continue the line and protect the kingdom. His longing was not merely personal, it was political, spiritual, and cosmic, because the continuity of Dharma often rides upon succession. Dashratha's childless years set in motion a series of decisions that would open the gates of destiny. The king was advised by wise ministers and surrounded by queens whose own stories braided into the larger tapestry. Kausalya, the first queen, carried a calm steadiness, a steadying light like a dawn that arrives without fanfare. Kaikeyi, the second queen, was astute and brave, a woman whose past bore the marks of unusual connections and whose heart was capable of both fierce loyalty and complex ambition. Sumitra, the third, was gentle and strong in a quieter way, a reservoir for patience and counsel. Each of these women was not merely decorative in the palace but entrusted with roles that would affect the future and intersect with the divine plan. The gods and sages conspired in subtler ways too, and the narrative needs a spark that can translate heavenly intention into earthly reality. That spark is ritual, and the ritual Dashratha performed was a yajna, a sacrificial consecration aimed at propelling the king's wishes into being. The Putrakameshti, a rite specifically for begetting heirs, was performed with devotion and strict observance, drawing fire and intention into a focused channel. Such rites do not guarantee outcomes, but they open doors and invite the universe to respond, often in forms that carry their own internal logic and surprises. To perform a yajna is to frame a desire within the language of the sacred, and when the world accepts that language, it replies in images. In Dashratha's case, the reply came in the form of a divine being who emerged from the sacrificial fire in a golden vessel. This being delivered a consecrated portion of food, a Somayajna's blessing, instructing the king to distribute it among his queens. The tiny act of sharing consecrated food gestures toward the communal nature of destiny. A single boon placed into the hands of several women multiplies and divides destiny in ways that will matter for decades to come. The portion of consecrated food carried within it the possibility of multiple births, and as each queen partook, the seeds of 3 lives were planted. Kausalya bore Rama, a son in whom something luminous sat like a sunset within flesh. Kaikeyi would bear Bharata, a prince whose loyalty and inner conflict would later shape one of the story's most poignant tests. Sumitra received not one but twin sons, Lakshmana and Shatrughna, companions who would mirror and amplify the fortunes of their brothers. Together these births created a constellation of characters whose fates were intertwined from the moment milk was warm to cradle them. Birth in this narrative is not merely biological, it is a meeting of previous lives, of vows and curses, of cosmic debts and promises. Rama's birth, for instance, is often retold as the culmination of a multitude of past intentions. Some stories say he had been a pious king or a virtuous husband in earlier existences, seeking conditions that would allow him to set a standard for right action. Other accounts suggest he took on certain human limitations intentionally, embracing suffering and denial to make his example more persuasive. All of these renderings agree on one thing: his birth was threaded with an awareness of purpose that reached beyond a single lifetime. Even before the infant took his first breath, the world seemed to recognize him. The palace at Ayodhya, bathed in the gentle light of its lamps, became a theater of small omens. Courtiers moved with a sense of waiting, as if a new season were pressing against the horizon. Sages millennia old, who lived like islands of focused thought and who kept maps of karma in their memory, saw the pattern and nodded. Thus the human and the divine gazes met, and the infant was not only a child of a king but a turning point for the moral life of a kingdom and for the universe's narrative arc. Sita's arrival into the story follows a different, yet equally resonant, logic. She was not born in a royal nursery, but rather emerged from the earth itself, plucked by King Janaka when he found her during a plowing ritual. The soil gave her as if nature itself had offered a cure for anguish and a mirror for virtue. Janaka raised her with a queen's care and a sage's respect for wonder, instructing her in the arts of the day while never confining the luster of her spirit. Her origin story binds her to the land and to a sense of duty that is both personal and universal, and her fate would become tightly woven with Rama's. The joining of Rama and Sita feels almost designed by the cosmos to heal and to test at once. They represent complementary principles. Rama embodies the public law of dharma, an ethic of duty that must sometimes set aside desire, and Sita embodies devotion and moral clarity rooted in the earth and in the heart. Their union is shown as both arranged and fated, because Janaka, who belonged to a line of kings and sages, recognized Rama's nature and invited him to the great challenge of Ravana's bow at a Swayamvara. The act of choosing a bride, in this case, is both ceremonial and revelatory. It confirms Rama's suitability and propels him toward trials that will reveal the depth of his character. Destiny, however, is a web, not a line, and to understand the birth of the Ramayana we must follow more than the royal threads. The sage Vishvamitra steps from the periphery into the center, pulling Rama from the palace toward the world beyond. Vishvamitra's need is urgent and personal, his hermitage is threatened by demons, and he seeks a protector with the strength of a warrior and the restraint of a sage. He sees in Rama not only a warrior but a moral exemplar whose presence will defend the boundary between order and chaos. This request begins the apprenticeship that will teach Rama about the sting of pain and the necessity of action. The journeys that follow are as much about learning as they are about testing. Rama and his brother Lakshmana accompany Vishvamitra into spaces where the supernatural bleeds into the human, facing Rakshasas whose cunning masks deeper metaphors of inner turmoil. These episodes are crafted as spiritual lessons disguised as battles, where the sword cuts away illusions and the hero must decide when force is rightful and when compassion is required. In these moments, the divine seed within Rama reveals itself not as untouchable perfection but as a disciplined compassion that chooses the welfare of others over the impulse to dominate. As Rama steps out from the polished floors of Ayodhya and onto the uneven paths of the forest, the pattern of destiny widens. The world beyond the palace has its own set of rules and its own claim on the hearts of men. Here the sacred and the profane rub shoulders, and each encounter reveals a facet of Dharma's complexity. The king's son learns that governance is not merely lawmaking but an art of relating, of listening to the barren as much as to the powerful, and of acting in ways that bind people to a shared moral vision. These lessons, received in the wild, prepare him for trials that will require both inner clarity and outer courage. The births of Rama and Sita are luminous beginnings, but they are also answers to deeper stories that reach back into time. Curses and boons, given names in the long history of Vedic and Puranic tales, and form many of the characters' motivations. A past misdeed can blossom into suffering generations later, and a blessing can seed greatness across centuries. This backward reach of consequence makes every birth an accumulation of prior choices, a ledger of moral transactions where no action is ever truly finished. In this way, the Ramayana becomes a moral cosmos, where the past presses on the present and calls each character to reckon with inherited responsibilities. Family, in these tales, is not a private matter but a field where public virtues are cultivated or neglected. Dashratha's love for his sons, for instance, cannot be read apart from his obligations as a king and the reputation of a dynasty. His decision to promise Kaikeyi a boon given long ago becomes a fulcrum for the narrative because personal loyalty and statecraft collide. This promise, born in a moment of gratitude during a past campaign, tests the elasticity of destiny. Can a vow made by a king to a queen bind the future choices of an entire realm? The tension between private affection and public duty shapes the drama that follows. When the boon is invoked and exile is demanded, the story probes the painful arithmetic of sacrifice. Rama, though a prince, accepts the forest with a kind of clarity that astonishes those who watch him. He sets aside his claim, not because he is weak, but because he understands the binding power of a father's word and the moral fabric that holds society together. Here the narrative asks a question about leadership. Does true virtue yield to promise, even when the price is personal ruin? Rama's answer becomes a defining image of the text, a moral beacon that will guide generations of listeners and readers. Intertwined destinies also manifest in the lives of secondary characters whose arcs amplify the main themes. Lakshmana, summoned by fraternal love and deep reverence, chooses to follow Rama into exile as a companion and protector at tremendous personal cost. Bharata, meanwhile, inherits the crown and faces a moral dilemma. He loves Rama with filial intensity but is bound to family politics that would otherwise secure his reign. Their choices reflect how the same family can become a crucible of competing claims, and how duty sometimes directs individuals to sacrifice their own comforts for a principle they view as greater than themselves. The role of women in the Ramayana is a study in moral authority and constrained agency, and their births and backgrounds matter just as much as the princes. Kausalya's steady heart and Kaikeyi's impassioned claim represent contrasting impulses within the domestic sphere and beyond. Sita's unshakable dignity and inner strength arrive from the soil itself and from Janaka's wise stewardship, showing that virtue can be native to earth and to upbringing. These women do not exist merely as accessories to male fate. They are active centers around which destinies pivot, sometimes with tragic cost and sometimes with sanctifying endurance. The cosmic backdrop keeps shifting, reminding us that births, vows, and duties are never solitary. Devas and asuras, sages and spirits, all react and adapt to the changes unfolding in the human realm. The gods who counsel Vishnu or glance at earth have their own dramas and investments, and sometimes their interventions are subtle, delivered as chance encounters or sudden insights. Their involvement does not erase human agency but rather knits a larger moral fabric, divine intent and human action moving in concert, each shaping the other in small and decisive ways. Rama's education extended beyond bow and blade. He was schooled in the prose of kingship, the geometry of alliances, and the poetry of hearts that do not concede to cynicism. Teachers taught him the stories of earlier ages, so that his actions would be informed by precedent and by the complex web of cause and consequence. Moral epics like the Ramayana rely on memory. The heroes are formed by stories they have heard as much as by the wars they fight. This apprenticeship in memory made Rama not only capable but wise, able to anchor his decisions in a lineage of moral exemplars. The narrative layers of the Ramayana make birth an event that carries legal, spiritual, and emotional weight. Each newborn prince or princess enters a field of expectations that is both narrow and expansive. There are rituals to mark their entry into society, naming ceremonies, and rites that align them with cosmic rhythms. Yet beneath these social forms runs the deeper current of destiny, where choices of previous lives and the ordinances of gods preside, sometimes with visible force and sometimes in ways that only later reveal themselves. This notion of latent destiny helps explain the presence of omens and portents around key arrivals. The heavens open or starlight bends toward the palace when a child of special fate is born. Birds may sing in particular patterns and cows may refuse to be milked, all seen as signs that the ordinary calendar of life has been interrupted. Such signs signal to observers that what they are witnessing is not merely the next leaf on a tree but the turning of an entire season. The people who see these signs respond with rituals and vows, compounding the moral energy surrounding the child. Sages and seers are those who listen most carefully to these signs, and their decisions can redirect destinies in subtle ways. They offer counsel that shapes marriages, alliances, and even the moral education of young princes. Their role is not to command fate but to interpret it, to point a compass at a child and say which north the family should seek. In the story of Rama, sages like Vasishtha and Vishvamitra act as both teachers and interpreters, aligning the human actors with a cosmic plan that is patient but not indifferent. The interweaving of human and divine destinies makes the Ramayana a mirror for how communities imagine their own moral foundations. Births are communal events, not private ones. The city of Ayodhya celebrates as one heart, and when the child grows, the whole polis feels the pull of his choices. The public life of a prince is a constant negotiation between personal feeling and social expectation, and the world watches because the stakes are high. A ruler's behavior, in these tales, sanctifies or corrodes social order, and so each birth can be seen as an investment in the culture's future. The story's geography deepens its moral imagination. Palaces are not simply homes but structures of duty, while forests are classrooms that test and refine character. Rivers and mountains become argument partners in the narrative, offering both obstacles and clarifying perspective. Sita's finding in the plowed earth evokes the idea that the land itself knows what it needs, and that when human beings align with that knowledge, they foster right action. That alignment happens through births, educations, and rites that bind individuals to the larger stewardship of the world. The human heart remains central to the unfolding drama, and births introduce new emotional economies into the tale. Love between siblings, the ache of separation, the burden of expectations, and the hunger for honor are all currencies traded in the market of destiny. These feelings are not secondary, they are the engines that drive choices and galvanize action. The birth of Rama and his brothers thus becomes an emotional deposit that will yield both suffering and wisdom throughout the narrative arc. Rama's impending life is also shaped by the many small interactions that follow his birth, moments that seem insignificant but later become crucial. A casual promise becomes the cause of exile, a child's boast becomes a test of honor, and a single meeting across a threshold changes alliances. The Ramayana teaches that destiny is often composed of apparently minor threads, each woven into a pattern too complex for any one mind to lay out at a glance. The listener is reminded that their own life might similarly pivot on tiny acts that gather unforeseen consequence. Partnerships and rivalries arising from births reveal how social bonds carry moral obligations. The brothers' relationships were forged in the same sacrificial ceremony, and those ties create a model of duty that values collective fidelity. At the same time, they expose how loyalty can be pressured by politics and individual temperaments. These dynamics make the family a testing ground for larger questions about justice, and the narrative uses the intimacy of kinship to dramatize public ethics. Destiny in the Ramayana is also a matter of time, and births bring with them the sense of a propitious moment. Some events are said to arrive when the time is ripe, as if fate waits on a slow, patient clock. Sages speak of yugas and epochs that set the moral possibilities for certain acts, and in this accordance a child's birth can feel like a punctual bell, meant to be struck at a particular historical moment. Such timing reinforces the sense that the birth of Rama and Sita was not merely personal but epical, meant to resonate across eras. The narrative's richness stems from its attention to interior life as much as outward action. Even the most public events, such as coronations or exiles, are narrated through the felt experience of those who live them. Rama's inner landscapes, his doubts, his gentle steadiness, his unwavering commitment, are described with care, so that the listener can inhabit the moral dilemmas alongside him. This focus on interiority transforms biography into moral speculation, letting birth be the opening chapter in a long inquiry into right living. In telling these stories aloud, storytellers shape them with tone and pacing, elongating some lines and compressing others, which mirrors the way destiny stretches and tightens. The birth narrative often receives lyrical emphasis, a ceremonial opening that invites listeners to lean forward and take note. Once given that attention, the subsequent life is not an unspooling but a layering, where each new event is read through the lens of that first revelation. Thus Rama's infancy continues to cast a long shadow over his choices as a young man and a future king. The Ramayana also insists on the moral complexity of rulers, showing that kings can be noble and fallible at once. Dashratha, who secures the conditions for Rama's birth, later becomes the instrument of a sorrowed exile because of a past pledge. The text does not exonerate him, but it does invite empathy, illustrating how a life of public responsibility is often weighed down by promises that harden like metal. This portrayal suggests that births, while joyous, also bring obligations that can lead to tragedy when combined with human weakness. The world of the Ramayana is drawn with an eye for nuance, and its births often mark the meeting point between private needs and public goods. Royal births matter because dynasties ensure the stability of realms, and the narrative shows that such continuity requires both moral clarity and personal sacrifice. The child who will become a ruler thus embodies a nation's hopes and is trained not only in arms but in restraint, counsel, and compassion. These qualities are the real inheritance that follows a birth and defines what kingship will mean. The tale moves us through a social landscape where rituals and relationships scaffold destiny, and the songs sung at births become part of a culture's memory. Lullabies and mantras whisper future possibilities into the ears of infants, and these cultural sounds reinforce communal expectations. In this way, a child's socialization is an act of moral introduction, a soft pedagogy that shapes the orientation of a life long before conscious decisions are made. The Ramayana uses these small domestic moments to show how civilizations reproduce their ideals through the tender work of child-rearing. Yet destiny remains mercurial, and births do not immunize one from suffering. The exile, the loss, and the trials that follow are reminders that even those born under auspicious signs must endure hardship. Suffering in this text is not merely punishment but a forge. The flames of adversity refine character and reveal the measure of virtue. This belief in the purifying power of suffering is a formative theme that links the moment of birth to the crucible of experience. The role of fate also raises questions about free will, and the Ramayana explores this tension without insisting on easy answers. Characters make choices that are their own and yet operate within a matrix of inherited promises and cosmic designs. Rama's consent to exile feels like an act of free will, grounded in his understanding of what duty requires, but it also functions as destiny's fulfillment. The narrative respects both patterns, suggesting that freedom and fate are not opposites but different scales of the same moral realm. As the story unfolds, the births of its protagonists continue to inform their identities, and the listener is invited to track how origin shapes inclination. Rama's innate equilibrium, Sita's rootedness, Lakshmana's devotion, and Bharata's conflicted honor all reflect the seeds of their beginnings. The text thus models a sociology of character, where birth contributes to temperament and where upbringing sculpts values. This attention to origin invites us to consider the forces that shape our own moral contours. The presence of prophecies in the narrative also channels the sense that births are not only beginnings but declarations. Soothsayers sometimes speak of what a child will become, and those utterances can catalyze actions by those who hear them. Prophecy in the Ramayana functions less as a cosmic sledgehammer than as a moral notice, prompting characters to prepare or avert certain outcomes. These prophecies thereby make destiny a conversation between future and present rather than a decree sealed before birth. Beyond royalty, the story accounts for births among sages and ascetics, whose ways of life produce different claims on destiny. A sage born into a hermitage might be called to a life of meditation whose effects ripple into the material world through counsel and intercession. Such births indicate that destiny is expressed not only through political power but also through spiritual influence. These quieter lines show how moral authority can arise from renunciation as powerfully as from rule. The Ramayana pays attention to generational continuity and rupture, showing how the consequences of one birth can be felt across lifetimes. The choices of fathers and mothers shape the field their children inherit, but those children are not mere repeats. They can redirect the line by making new kinds of choices. This subtle interplay between repetition and innovation gives the tale its historical breadth, as if each generation composes a new movement within a long symphony. The world of ritual performs the role of a moral grammar, clarifying how birth is to be celebrated and integrated into community. Naming rights, first haircuts, and the first step into learning are all moments when society claims a child and introduces them to shared obligations. These ceremonies are not empty formalities, they encode values and communicate to the child their place in the moral order. In describing these rites, the tale teaches listeners about how institutions help shape destiny through structured attention. Metaphors of seed and harvest recur through the narrative, making birth an agricultural image of potential and patience. Plants germinate slowly and then, under care and time, produce fruit that feeds many. Similarly, the birth of Rama is the sowing of a principle that requires cultivation through conduct and trial before it ripens into public benefit. This agricultural lens reminds us that moral development is a long, steady mandate rather than a sudden miracle, and it calls for daily tending. The woven nature of destiny is further dramatized through the interlocking fates of friend and foe. Even antagonists in the story, like Ravana, have origins and motivations that make the conflict more than a simple contest of good versus evil. Ravana's own birth, his boons, and his sense of righteousness came from a different moral logic that valued prowess and pride, and in the collision between him and Rama we see how competing destinies test the limits of justice. The births of opposing figures thus set the stage for an epic dialectic between values. Music and poetry accompany many of these articulations of fate, and bards who sing the story emphasize refrains that tie birth to consequence. The Psalms are mnemonic devices that allow listeners to carry lines of moral reasoning in their memory, and they shape how the community will retell its past. Oral transmission makes the tale adaptable, allowing each performance to highlight different threads while preserving the core moral questions sparked at birth. This fluidity ensures that the Ramayana remains a living story, responsive to each new audience's dilemmas. The saga's domestic details are as telling as its cosmic themes, and births are painted with sensory richness, the smell of sandalwood in the palace nursery, the shivering first cries echoing through corridors, the tremor of a queen's hope knit to the hum of a fire ritual. These textures make the narrative immediate and human, reminding listeners that even cosmic actors are made of ordinary sensations. By dwelling on material particulars, the story universalizes moral stakes so they resonate in the small rooms where people live their lives. Ethical dilemmas in the narrative often originate at the point of birth because obligations to family, duty, and society emanate from these earliest moments. Kings promise boons to secure heirs, mothers shape values in infancy, and siblings learn loyalty as a daily discipline. These micro-level acts accumulate into macro-level consequences, teaching that moral architecture is built brick by brick, beginning with newborns and ending with the arc of a life lived well or poorly. The births in the Ramayana thus function as cornerstones for a collective ethic. The mythic quality of the tale allows for symbolic readings of birth that speak to the human search for purpose. Rama can be read as the ideal that any person might strive toward, the form of right action distilled into human terms. Sita represents the inner life, the soul's fidelity to truth and the land. The births of these figures become allegories that offer models more than historical claims, which is why the story endures and speaks across cultures and eras. It sources hope for listeners who seek meaning in their own beginnings. Performance tradition also modifies the contour of birth narratives, and regional retellings emphasize local values and concerns. In some versions, Sita's origin is further dramatized to highlight fertility rites, while others stress Rama's ascetic leanings. This plurality makes the Ramayana a treasury rather than a single canon, allowing communities to mold the myth to their moral needs while preserving a core structure. The multiplicity of retellings demonstrates how birth narratives function as cultural tools that help societies define themselves. As the story moves from birth to adolescence, the youthful episodes accumulate into a preparation for the central trials that will determine whether the initial promise is kept. Rama's adolescence is a series of disciplined rehearsals in humility and strength, and each encounter carefully aligns him with the virtues he will need. The listener travels with him through these formative scenes and perceives how a life shaped by ritual, counsel, and struggle grows into a moral force capable of bearing great burdens. Birth, then, is the opening chord of a lifelong composition. Ultimately, the birth of the Ramayana is not a single event but a continual unfolding, an invitation to contemplate how the origins of a life inform its destiny. As you listen, whether traveling a road or tending work, the narrative asks you to consider your own origin story and the webs it tethers you to. Each promise you inherit, each vow you make, and each relation you accept participates in a larger weave that moves across time and affects the people who come after. In that way, the Ramayana's births speak to the listener directly, reminding us that our lives, like those of its heroes, are threads in a tapestry far larger than any one of us. When storytellers reach the moments of naming and celebration, they are doing more than marking time, they are situating an individual within a communal memory. Names in the Ramayana often carry meanings that illuminate character, and the act of naming is a binding of expectation and identity. To be called Rama is to be called to righteousness, to be called Sita is to be called to rooted devotion, and these names perform the moral shaping that the tale insists on from its outset. Such acts show how language participates in destiny, turning sound into ethical architecture. The interplay between personal identity and cosmic role becomes visible in how the characters respond to challenge. Rama's obedience is not passive resignation but an active practice of choosing duty over self-interest, formed long before in his upbringing and confirmed at his birth. Sita's constancy is not mere endurance but a planted strength that grows from her earthborn origin and Janaka's care. These traits, established early in life, make later trials intelligible as continuations of formative purposes rather than abrupt tests without precedent. The Ramayana's attention to lineage underlines how births create obligations that can be generative as well as constraining. The sons born from the sacrificial portion share a bond that calls them to mutual fidelity and mutual sacrifice, and that bond becomes the story's moral engine. The narrative is less interested in isolated heroism and more invested in the ways families sustain or undermine the principles they claim to protect. In dramatizing these familial webs, the tale shows that a birth is a social contract signed in the small print of affection and duty. Even in moments of grief and exile, the memory of the birth moments provides strength and clarity for the characters. Dashratha's lament for his son and Rama's recollection of palace teachings color their responses and give their suffering a narrative frame. Memory functions as a sustaining resource, allowing characters to find meaning in loss and to act with integrity when circumstances demand it. In this way, birth and remembrance become comrades in the ethical life, each supporting the other when the road grows difficult. The cosmological stakes of the narrative make the personal actions of its protagonists weighty, and this tension becomes apparent as the story marches toward larger confrontations. Each birth, each promise, and each partnership stitches moral authority into the fabric of the world, and so the fate of individuals and the fate of the cosmos become inseparable. The Ramayana thus invites listeners to hold the micro and the macro together, recognizing that small acts can have wide effects and that births are seeds of potential that may alter the course of history. In retelling the origins of this epic, storytellers also reflect on the nature of storytelling itself. Birth narratives function as anchors for attention, and by investing time and detail in these moments, a narrator trains listeners to watch for moral consequences. They teach patience, suggesting that to understand a life is to attend to its beginnings and the slow processes that follow. Thus, the opening episodes of the Ramayana set a pattern of attentive listening that the remainder of the tale will reward. The enduring power of the Ramayana's birth scenes lies in their invitation to identification and emulation. Audience members may see in Rama a model to admire, in Sita an example of inner strength, and in the supportive brothers an image of loyal companionship. Such identification matters because myths are not only entertainment but moral instruction. They provide patterns for conduct by showing what a life shaped by virtue looks like. Births, in this narrative, are the first lines of those instructive patterns. When a culture chooses to retell certain births over centuries, it is choosing to sustain particular values. The Ramayana's persistent popularity suggests that many communities found in its origin scenes a language for understanding authority, duty, and sacrifice. Whether recited in temples or narrated in household alcoves, the story's beginnings became a cultural grammar for how to live and how to honor the ties that bind. The births of its main figures thus became living parables carried forward across time. Even as the tale reveres destiny, it never lets character off the hook. The princes and princesses are subject to tests that demand moral clarity, and their responses affect not only their own futures but the moral orientation of whole societies. Birth sets the stage, but action decides the outcome. The world watches how those who were born under auspicious signs comport themselves when temptation and grief arrive. This interplay sustains the narrative energy of the Ramayana and ensures that birth is only the first note in a long, morally charged melody. The reader or listener is invited to consider what their own births signify in terms of responsibilities and possibilities. The narrative invites no facile conclusion, instead offering reflection that our origins matter, that our actions are part of a chain, and that each of us participates in a larger drama. The Ramayana's birth stories are thus neither relics nor mere romance. They are tools for moral imagination, resources for anyone who seeks to align life with a deeper sense of purpose. Listening closely, one may find guidance and consolation in the echoes of those first moments. The web of interconnected destinies in the Ramayana continues to teach about interdependence and moral courage. Births are the threadheads from which the tapestry unfurls, but the tapestry is woven by many hands with differing motives and capacities. Each character's trajectory reveals how freedom and constraint interact, how personal fidelity intersects with public duty, and how compassion is often the decisive virtue that redeems suffering. The story's origins carry these lessons forward, reminding listeners that the way a life starts often indicates how it should proceed. In every recounting of the Ramayana's origin, the central drama remains a timeless lesson about responsibility. A child's coming into the world calls for community, for vows to nurture and protect, and for a moral education that prepares them for service rather than mere comfort. Rama's birth, and the births of those around him, set such an education into motion, shaping characters to meet the world's needs. The tale thus serves as a blueprint for thoughtful living, where birth becomes both promise and task. Finally, as the mythic time of the Ramayana unfolds into the lives of its heroes, births continue to echo in decisions made in courts, forests, and camps. The early scenes of consecration and promise resonate in moments of renunciation, in the loyalty of siblings and the endurance of lovers. The narrative never forgets that every grand action was once a small breath in a palace or a field, and it invites listeners to recognize the sanctity of beginnings. In that honor, the birth of the Ramayana remains a living testament to the way destinies intertwine and unfold across time. When the sun rose on the morning that would change everything, Ayodhya lay in a hush that felt like the breath held before a long plunge. Rama moved through the palace corridors with the quiet of a man obeying the threads of duty, his face a map of steady resolve and contained sorrow. People watched him go as if they could tuck a blessing into the fold of his robe, and when Dasaratha's house echoed with laments, Rama did not look back beyond a single, reverent bow. He stepped out into the wide world with Sita and Lakshmana at his side, and the city seemed to fold itself into a palace of memory behind them. Every step Rama took was a lesson in letting go. Subscribe and share in the comments what moves you more, his courage to walk away or the love that made it hurt. They walked past the gardens where children had once chased peacocks and past the banyan trees that had held the gossip of ministers and queens. The air smelled of wet earth and jasmine, and even the stones of Ayodhya seemed to hold a last warmth for their feet. Rama felt the weight of exile like a physical garment, heavy and rough, yet he wrapped himself in it without complaint because his choice was his principle made visible. Sita walked beside him with hands composed and eyes that carried a light no longer dazzled by gold but steadied by love. Lakshmana, younger and fierier, had bound himself to his brother like a second skin. He took the aloneness of the road with a watchful, guarded energy. He noticed the small things, the way birds fell quiet as the travelers passed, the way stray dogs began to follow at a distance and then slunk away, the subtle change in the farmers' gazes. The city gates closed behind them with a sound like an ending, and the three of them moved into the landscape of their exile, where every sign and stream would become part of their testament. The first stretch of their journey was a transition from cultivated land to the open country that led to the forests. Fields gave way to scrub and then to trees that thickened by the hour, their trunks like the columns of a cathedral. Rama's footsteps traced new maps on the earth. He learned to read the signs of peacocks and deer, the soft trails where neem leaves had been crushed and the places where elephants had rolled in mud. Each step was a lesson in the ordinary miracles of the wild, and each lesson folded itself into a patient, growing knowledge of survival. They did not travel with a retinue but with a few attendants and the essentials that could be carried. Their garb shifted from silk and ornament to homespun, and the glitter of royal life was replaced by the steady need for warmth at night and shelter from sudden rains. Meals were leaner and more regular, and yet the simplicity had its own richness. A bowl of porridge under a sky vaster than any palace ceiling tasted like providence. Sita learned to manage the small economy of camp life with a grace that made the three of them a miniature domestic kingdom within the forest. The forests they entered were described in the epics with names and stories, but for those first days they were simply great, breathing places where the rules of palace living slowly came undone. Fruit trees offered seasonal gifts, and Rama accepted what the forest gave him with the humility of a guest. They bathed in clear rivers whose stones glinted like coins and performed the morning rituals of ablution and prayer with hands that steadied themselves on memory and faith. Nature marked time differently here. Dawn was heralded by birds, not trumpets, and the shapes of clouds set the rhythm of rest and movement. As they moved deeper, they encountered ascetics along the way, scattered like small beacons of old magics and relentless discipline. Some were mild and hospitable, offering what they could spare: fresh water, barley, a sheltering veranda of leaves. Others were severe, their eyes sharp with renunciation, their lives a constant denial of ease, and they tested the traveler's understanding of devotion. Rama listened with the humility of one learning, and Sita's presence turned each encounter into a conversation about the purpose of duty and the nature of companionship. Vishvamitra was the first great sage of consequence who joined them, and his arrival shifted the direction of their exile. He came not as a mere passerby but as a teacher with a mission, and he needed Rama's prowess for tasks that had grown thorny in distant hermitages. With him came tales of demons troubling sages and of fires that would not burn their way out. He spoke of ascetic power and celestial weapons with a tone that suggested the world had layers of struggle beyond mortal grievances. Rama answered with the quiet competence of one who had been trained in the bow from youth, and Lakshmana took to his side with a protective fierceness. Under Vishvamitra's guidance, Rama's exile took on a different texture. It became not only a moral trial but a proving ground for the skills of kingship and warriorhood. He learned to aim his arrows with a focus that balanced restraint and necessity, and he received weapons that had ritual names and gravitas. The forest seemed to open and reveal itself as a place where the cosmic and the personal met, the trees listened, and the rivers judged. Sita observed these lessons with an interest that was equal parts concern and admiration, watching Rama shape himself into a figure who could protect and nurture at once. They came, inevitably, to the region called Dandaka, a vast and ancient wood that had been the refuge for all manner of beings, ascetics, rajas in exile, and rakshasas who thrived in the shadow. Dandaka was a forest that swallowed ordinary time, days diluted into a long, meditative present. The canopy above was a deep green that filtered the sun into soft streaks, and strange flowers spilled their scents at dawn and dusk like secret offerings. In such a place, the line between danger and the divine was thin, and every rustle could be a test. Soon enough, signs of unrest appeared, farms abandoned, villages empty, and hermitages with cell doors broken or smoldering. Vishvamitra's warnings were not exaggerated. The Dandaka forest had become a stage for the hungry ambitions of Rakshasas who preyed on anyone who strayed. The travelers adjusted their pace and their watchfulness accordingly, setting up camps with careful perimeters and listening for the night cries that belonged to the forest's less hospitable dwellers. Even in the face of threat, there was a solemn beauty to this vigilance, like the slow turning of a prayer wheel. It was in this tense atmosphere that Shurpanakha's shadow first fell across their path. Her approach was not gentle. She came with the audacity of one accustomed to getting what she wanted, and she tested boundaries with a frankness that shocked the rhythms of the camp. Her encounter with Rama and Lakshmana altered the day's atmosphere, producing a flash of tension that would ripple into greater calamities. She was not merely a figure of malice, she was a catalyst, a reminder that exile was not a place of passive suffering but a crucible where small acts could generate great consequences. When Shurpanakha advanced and was rebuffed, the scene escalated into violence and retribution that was as much about pride as it was about defense. Lakshmana's hand was quick to protect, and his actions left scars across the forest's social fabric. The tale that followed, the humiliation and transformation of Shurpanakha, was not only an episode of anger but a pivot that set larger plans into motion. The forest, in its patient way, witnessed the human heart's propensities and the Rakshas's vengefulness, storing each act like a memory stored under leaf and root. The trio moved on, but the consequences did not vanish. They haunted the trails like a scent that could not be washed away. Sita's safety became a concern not merely for her husband's love but for the fragile order of the forest community. Her presence attracted both reverence and dangerous fascination, and the menacing pull of desire and power began to find their expressions in the darker corners of Dandaka. Rama's vigilance became a literal shield, and Lakshmana grew ever more watchful, a sentinel whose mind did not rest. It was in the broken stillness of these days that the golden deer appeared, an apparition so perfect that it seemed like a crafted myth given life. Maricha, the enchanted demon, took the form of this deer and moved with an artful grace that made Sita longing and curious. She asked Rama for the deer, and the soft pleading of that request bent Rama's protective prudence into a decision. He stepped into the chase not knowing the deeper snare, and in doing so, he stepped into one of the exile's most devastating tests. Rama pursued the golden deer with arrows that sang through the air like decisive truths, and the forest watched as beauty and deception braided together. The chase was a study in skill and melancholy. Rama's heart, trained to see the world as a place of duty, felt the tug of longing because Sita's voice reached him from the invisible thread of relationship. Lakshmana remained with Sita, but even that presence could not unmake the chain of events set in motion by the deer. When Rama pierced the creature and the illusion dissolved, a voice echoed, a mimicry meant to lure, to fracture, to create a moment of tragic absence. Sita's loneliness in that small clearing grew to a size that could be heard by ravens and righteous men alike. She pleaded for Rama to come back, and when he did not return at once, she insisted that Lakshmana search, fearing some strange trick. Lakshmana, though stern, was compassionate enough to honor Sita's anxieties, and he drew the famous line in the sand that would later be recalled by many as the protective mark of sanctity. The moment of his departure was a fragile hinge upon which the world would turn. Into the gap walked Ravana, the lion among Rakshasas, a sovereign of ambition whose mind was a calculus of desire and conquest. He saw Sita and designed a plan with the cold meticulousness of a strategist. He achieved the impossible by cunning. Jatayu fought and fell, an eagle of valor who challenged the abductor and paid with his wings and life. Rama and Lakshmana came back to find only traces, a broken branch, a mantle of grief, Sita gone like a light snuffed by a careless hand. Their anguish was a river that did not know the contour of its banks. It overflowed with questions and immediate action. Rama's grief was not theatrically loud but profound and elemental. He who had accepted exile without rancor now tasted a pain that made the forest itself seem like a memory too fragile to be mourned in private. Their search began in earnest, extending to every hermitage and hollow, seeking help from kings and sages and the denizens of the wild. Each who encountered their sorrow tried to answer it in the ways they could, men with horses and arrows, birds with their eyes, sages with sacred counsel. It was during this search that they met individuals who would shape the future response: Sugriva, the exiled monkey king, and Hanuman, a unique spirit of devotion and intelligence. The Vanaras were not simply animals but beings with voices and counsels, with allegiances formed in the flux of forest politics. Rama's honor and promise to help Sugriva regain his throne were intertwined, a pact formed for mutual need and ethical design, and it created an army of sorts, a force knit together with oaths and the desire for restored justice. The forest suddenly teemed with new life, coded plans, whispered strategies, and the building of a coalition that would cross seas. As the Vanara host gathered strength, the forests became campgrounds for councils and training, a theater of preparations. They built bridges of fallen trees and rehearsed the pulling of chariots and the throwing of stones. Even the smallest monkey learned to carry messages. During these days, stories of Sita's virtue and Ram's righteousness were recited around fires, binding the troops with a shared purpose that was more than militaristic. It was spiritual and ethical. Night after night, the forest that had been a refuge for exile turned into the nerve center of a rescue mission. The sacredness of these woods was not merely situational. It had histories embedded in its soil, hymns chanted long ago, rituals performed by sages whose ashes lineated the ground, and ancient trees that remembered kings as if they were leaves. Rama and Sita, even in suffering, often sat beneath such trees and felt the continuity of time. The constancy of the forest gave them a perspective beyond immediate pain. The slow cycle of growth and decay taught them that endurance has its own nobility. In silence and in speech, the forest consoled and instructed. Seasons turned, and with them the light in the canopy changed. Monsoons came with an insistence that rewired everything. Rivers rose and paths disappeared, camps had to be moved, and health required tending with herbal lore that the sages and Vanaras shared. The trio learned to fend off fever and to treat wounds with poultices and simple surgeries, and in that practical science there was an intimacy that drew them closer to the wild. It was a survival liturgy performed by hands that knew both the city and the wilderness. Along the way, they met Shebri, an old woman whose devotion was as fierce as the sun. She offered fruits tasted and chosen for Rama as if he were a king returned rather than an exile in search of his queen. Her story was a small, shining thing, a life devoted to a single ideal, shaped by patience and the ritual of awaiting a savior. Her simple hospitality, offered without the ceremony of courts, felt like a direct, human altar and showed how devotion could be lived out in the smallest acts. There were other sages whose advice had weight and who helped frame the war ahead with counsel that was both strategic and moral. Conversations under star-scattered skies became lessons in statesmanship. Rama listened to wise counsel and distilled from it not just military plans but a notion of what victory would mean for the moral order. He pondered the cost of war, the count of lives that would be sacrificed, and he tried to ensure that the path he walked would avoid unnecessary cruelty. Even a war waged for rescue and justice, he understood, must be tempered by the principles that made him worthy of kingship. In the hours of waiting and in the bustle of preparation, Rama's internal trial deepened. Exile was not simply about leaving a throne, it was about the remaking of identity. He learned patience in a way that was not sentimental but disciplined, and he discovered that authority can be earned anew by walking through suffering without bitterness. Sita's steadfastness and Lakshmana's fierce loyalty were parts of that examination. Their companionship offered him the mirror of what right conduct looks like when everything else is lost. The forests held, too, their own moral tests for the Vanaras. Small disputes among them had to be resolved without the heavy-handedness that a human sovereign might employ. Sugrava's complex feelings of betrayal and friendship were negotiated in that liminal space, with Rama as both a friend and a judge, dispensing justice in ways that would be accepted by beings who thought and felt differently. He learned to speak across species and experiences, and in doing so he expanded his capacity for empathy and leadership. Hanuman's devotion became a lesson in the power of focused faith. He flew, leapt, and listened with a kind of holy intensity that lifted everyone around him. His stories about tracing scents and shadows in the forest became parables about the necessity of loyalty. His meeting with Rama cemented a partnership that would eventually bridge the ocean between the mainland and Lanka, but long before that grand moment, he proved his worth through cunning reconnaissance and fearless ventures into the unknown. The forest itself seemed to recognize such devotion, opening secret paths and revealing food caches that helped sustain the army. The sages also required Rama to perform sacrifices and rituals to keep the gods inclined towards their cause, and those rites were often quiet, intricate affairs. Fire was tended, mantras were intoned, and offerings were made not as mechanical obligations but as acts of relationship with forces larger than themselves. In performing these rituals, Rama reaffirmed a cultural continuity that held even in exile, that the divine could be engaged through discipline, devotion, and ethical action. Each rite knitted them more closely to the world they sought to mend. There were moments when the forest tested them with subtle seductions, a clear pool that seemed to offer oblivion, a mango tree laden with the sweetest of fruit, a hidden spring whose coolness invited languor. Sita felt the pull of comfort and the temptation of forgetting the weight of loss, but she resisted with an inner fortitude that deepened through daily choices. The trials were not only battles and commands, they were moments in which giving in to comfort would have meant surrendering the moral clarity that had carried them so far. Encounters with lesser foes, robbers, minor demons, and human brigands, were abundant and taught the travelers to adapt tactics. Some threats required the use of charm and negotiation, others required a firmness that permitted no compromise. The forest, in this way, served as a school of flexible morality, where brutal force was sometimes necessary and sometimes merely a failure of imagination. Rama's choices in these small conflicts sharpened his discernment about when to obliterate danger and when to transform it. As the search stretched on, the maps in their heads became populated with names and features that had previously belonged only to myth. Places like Chitrakoot acquired a life beyond their poetic evocations. Chitrakoot became a lived reality of rivers and caves, of shepherds and hermits, and of a community that folded them in like a familiar garment. They stayed there for spells of time, building small shelters, sharing bread and stories, and feeling, again, the strange consolation of belonging to a land that did not demand titles. The moral economy of exile required new models of sustenance, and the trio learned from the forest's inhabitants how to plant quick crops, how to harvest roots without stripping the earth, and how to ration supplies when the monsoons took their toll. Sita's hands moved with practical skill in these matters, turning the humble into the sufficient. Her presence in the camp was a continuous offering of domestic wisdom, a form of kingship exercised through care rather than decree. Stories of heroism emerged in fragments across the woodland: monkeys who stole provisions from otherwise impregnable forts, sailors who offered secret information about the sea routes, and birds who carried messages like winged archives. Each contribution to the search felt like an additional thread being woven into a net designed to catch fate. The sense of a collective endeavor grew stronger, and with it came a communal courage that made the impossible feel closer. Rama's relationship with nature deepened into a reciprocal exchange. He protected the groves, tended the sacred fires, and ensured that no wanton destruction befouled the places that sheltered so many. The forest, in return, held memories of the lost and offered small mercies, a sudden bounty of fruit, a clear night when navigation was effortless, or the guidance of an old hermit who had once known of such things. It was a two-way covenant, the kind that changes a person's moral map. Shifts in the political landscape of the nearby regions affected the forest's calm. Rival kings and opportunistic chiefs read the tale of exile and decided their own courses. Some sided with Rama out of respect for righteousness, others remained aloof or hostile. These human dynamics reinforced that the exile was not merely a private misfortune but a public event with repercussions that extended beyond the canopy. The moral implications of the exile were debated in minor courts and across riverbanks, and each judgment influenced the network of alliances that would be crucial to the coming conflict. Sita herself had audiences with sages who probed at questions of duty, honor, and womanhood, sometimes in tones that were compassionate and sometimes in tones that were blunt. She answered with dignity and clarity, asserting her choice to stand with Rama despite the comforts she had left behind. Her speeches in these settings were less about assertion than about the steady translation of love into ethical practice. In those moments, the forest heard a voice that made its own ethics seem less obscure and more human. The approaching confrontation with Lanka cast long strategic shadows across the forest camps. Engineers among the Vanaras began to plan the physics of the crossing, how to move material, how to manage ships or build bridges, and their labor was an uncanny blend of animal strength and human ingenuity. The riverbanks became workshops of improvisation, places where ingenuity was measured by the day's yield and where the destruction of a storm could mean a week's delay. The forest watched over this activity with an approving hush, as if nature itself appreciated the creativity of beings working in concert. Rama spent long nights in council with Sugriva and his commanders, thinking not only about the tactical deployment of troops but also about the ethical consequences of war. He wondered how to balance the necessity of force with the preservation of a moral world he hoped to rebuild afterwards. These meditations were not abstract. They were lived by the men and creatures who would follow orders into danger, and the weight of that responsibility sat in Rama's jaw as he spoke. His leadership was a constant triage between compassion and the hard calculus of duty. There were smaller, quieter victories in the forest that steadied their spirits, a recovered message that revealed Sita's last known place, a trapped messenger freed who then supplied a clue, a recovered relic that reminded them of home. Each of these incremental successes stitched one more thread into the covering hope that shielded their days. The forest, in its layered wisdom, imparted the sense that even the smallest opening could be a turning point and that perseverance often mattered more than spectacular feats. The natural world continued its own cycles, oblivious to human suffering yet responsive in ways that felt nearly providential. Deer migrated, flowers bloomed and faded, and storms cleared the air, giving everything a washed, luminous clarity. Such moments gave the travelers permission to feel joy amid grief, a reminder that sorrow and beauty can coexist and that the world does not simplify to fit human need. These contrasts taught patience and humility. In those interstitial times, tales were told and retold around campfires, epics and memoirs braided together so that each retelling served an educative, moral function. The stories were about kings who failed and succeeded, about sages whose austerities changed destinies, about lovers who were tested across oceans and forests. Each tale was a mirror and a warning, a way of teaching younger Vanaras and even Rama and Lakshmana to hold a longer perspective. It was a living curriculum that made the forest a school for hearts as much as a camp for soldiers. The presence of women in these woods, Sita, shrubbery, queenly survivors of lesser episodes, provided a wider social texture to exile. They were not side figures but active participants in moral adjudication, practical organization, and spiritual counsel. Their voices often provided the soft but stubborn wisdom that steadied decisions. Sita's conversations with elder women and sages taught her strategies of negotiation and care that would later be crucial in the contest for reputation and truth. As allies gathered and plans became more detailed, the forest saw the birth of rituals that fused pragmatic necessity and spiritual preparation. There were purification ceremonies that marked the moving of troops, vows taken under particular trees believed to be older than any living memory, and offerings to the river that would later be crossed. These acts were not mere superstition, they were ways of aligning hearts and minds for what lay ahead, composing a moral field that would be difficult to destroy even by war. The figure of Ravana loomed in stories recited in many tongues, and though he remained across the sea, his shadow filtered through the forests like a chill wind. He was described as splendid and monstrous, a being of many layers whose intellect had been corrupted by craving. For Rama and his companions, Ravana embodied the metaphysical danger of unchecked power combined with personal desire, a cautionary exemplar of how majesty can be twisted by vice. That image sharpened their resolve. Rescuing Sita was not only a personal rescue but a reassertion of moral order. The task of reconnaissance grew larger. Scouts like Hanuman were indispensable. They moved through tree canopies and along riverbanks, returning with details that would be used to craft a military and moral strategy. Some scouts came back with less than they hoped, their courage tested against the cunning of opponents. Still, the network of intelligence grew, and the forest corridors carried secret news like a kind of subterranean stream that fed the surface effort. There were days of seeming calm when doubt whittled away at morale. Questions arose about the possibility of failure, about whether the costs would outweigh the gains. On such days, Rama's leadership took a pastoral turn. He listened closely, offered counsel, and sometimes shared his own doubts to be met with the collective courage around him. It was in these small communal acts of confession and encouragement that the force's resilience was forged. Rama's sense of kingship was being recast in exile. He no longer ruled from a throne but from the trust placed in him by a ragged and complex collection of beings. Authority became conversational, something won through reciprocity, sacrifice, and moral clarity. He began to see that true sovereignty could be exercised without ostentation, by ensuring justice and care for even the smallest follower. Such an ethos would later be the measure against which his rule in Ayodhya would be judged. The psychology of the forest tested friendships as much as it tested military prowess. Ambition found its ways even among those on the side of righteousness. Envy and the hunger for recognition crept into councils and had to be treated. Sugriva's own troubles, his fear of being undermined, were examples of how exile and struggle could exacerbate personal faults. Rama spent time negotiating not only with enemies but within his own coalition, because victory without unity risked being hollow. During the long months of preparation, women in the camps kept traditions of home alive in small rituals that preserved culture, offerings at dawn, songs that encouraged sleep, and tales that reminded younger listeners of propriety. These were not merely nostalgic acts, they were stabilizing practices that tethered hearts to a moral center. Sita participated deeply in these domestic sacraments, her presence a moralizing force that reframed the campaign as one of rescue and restoration, not conquest. There were episodes of compassion that stood apart from strategy, enemies who surrendered and were forgiven, towns spared from plunder because they offered tribute without violence, and Rakshasas who renounced their ways under the counsel of a sage. Such acts complicated the simple narrative of good versus evil and showed that the forest cultivated, in many hearts, a capacity for moral change. Rama's leadership encouraged such transformations where possible, a choice that sometimes cost him short-term advantage but preserved a wider ethical coherence. The final months before the crossing to Lanka were consumed by intense labor and delicate coordination. Bridges were rebuilt, stores amassed, and a fleet of sorts was imagined with such concrete detail that it felt inevitable. The forest had become a place of industry, turning its literal resources into the instruments of a moral mission. The idea of crossing the ocean, once a mythic impossibility, settled into the practical minds of engineers and brawny workers who then made it their daily task. On the eve of departure from the forest camps, there was a ceremony that gathered every faction into a single, solemn moment. They invoked gods, sages, and ancestors, and each offering was both personal and political. It was a farewell to a place that had been both refuge and school, a slow unfastening of the roots that had been inserted into the soil of exile. Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana stood together, their faces lit by the fires of many nights, and they felt the weight of the coming storm and the promise that carried them onward. The departure itself was a hush of efficient movement, a migration of beings who had become more than the sum of their parts. The forest watched them leave with the indifferent kindness of nature. Trees that had sheltered them were left intact, and hearths were extinguished with respect. Their passage out of the sacred woods was an act of stewardship. They did not pillage in victory but packed with an ethic of care. Crossing from the forest camps to the sea was a pilgrimage that transformed into a martial undertaking. The Vanera engineers steadied the currents, the winds, and the logs. They learned how to fashion a path over water with ingenuity and labor, and their work became an extended hymn to cooperation. Each step towards Lanka was a narrative thread linking exile to the possibility of reversal and redemption. Hanuman's leap to Lanka, a moment that would be told and retold in ages to come, began as a child's daring and an adult's faith. He carried with him a message wrapped in hope, and his flight over the waters was both a literal crossing and a metaphor for the ways devotion bridges worlds. He moved through the wind with the lightness of a being who had surrendered to a higher purpose, and when he landed, the sacred forests they had left behind were both a memory and a spouse, having given them what they needed to cross. The final campaign that followed emanated from the lessons of the forest: improvisation, restraint, compassion, and implacable resolve. The army that marched to Lanka was not merely an instrument of revenge but the manifestation of a moral project honed in fireflies and under banyan branches. When the island fell and Sita was recovered, the moral questions did not end, they multiplied. How to measure honor against suspicion? How to re-enter kingship after years lived under trees? Those were deeper questions than any battlefield victory could answer. The return journeys intersected with the same forests that had sent them forth, now appearing smaller and less alien. Homecomings are never simple, and the passage through the sacred woods again felt like moving through a house of recollections. The people of Ayodhya received the triumphant travelers with mixed joy and anxious skepticism, and Rama's test of right rule began anew in the squares and corridors of the city. The exile had been a crucible. The question now was whether the metal of a ruler's soul had been forged or merely scarred. What made the exile extraordinary was not merely the tribulations, but the way those trials turned inward as much as outward, becoming a meditation on power, duty, and love. The sacred forests had been a living classroom where the lessons were taught in storms and songs, by sages and animals, by the soft hands that fed the weary and the fierce ones that stood guard at night. When listeners drive through their own highways, these stories of care, endurance, and moral clarity can be companions, like a light that guides even in the densest dark. Long after the trees returned to their ordinary obscurity, the exile's transformations remained, visible in acts of governance and in the continued memory of the people. Rama's rule after exile was judged not only by prosperity but by whether his reign honored the lessons of restraint and compassion learned in the woods. The forests themselves continued to be places where pilgrims and kings found perspective, and their legends became part of the moral scaffolding that would hold countless lives together. In the end, the exile across the sacred forests was a long narrative of testing and teaching, where every encounter, be it with a demon, a sage, an old woman, or a monkey, was an opportunity to refine character. The journey reshaped identities and created alliances that would bend the course of kingdoms. More than a tale of loss and return, it remained an epic about the slow and humbling work of becoming worthy of power, a story that invites anyone listening, wherever they may be, to consider what trials might yet teach them. Even now, when the wind passes through a certain grove or when a river bends at just the right place, the memory of what happened there seems to whisper that endurance is a form of revelation, that companionship can convert exile into mission, and that the forest holds both danger and instruction. To listen to the tale of Rama's exile is, in some small way, to sit at the feet of a teacher who instructs through example rather than mere command. The forests, those vast cathedrals of leaf and root, keep those lessons alive for anyone willing to walk their shadowed paths. The kingdom of Ayodhya had once been a place of sunlit streets and steady rule, a tapestry woven from oaths and seasons, from laughter and law. News traveled by couriers with braided hair, by travelers who hummed songs of harvest and of kings, and by the slow certainty of justice. People took the shape of their rulers, and in those years Ayodhya took the shape of Rama, disciplined, sincere, the promise of Dharma walking on 2 feet. When shadows first reached the outskirts, they were little more than cool evenings on a late summer wind, and the city told itself that night would pass as it always did. But great stories do not wait politely at the edges. The exile of Rama, the prince with the calm eyes and the quiet laugh, carved a canyon across the kingdom's faith. Kakeyi's demand had been a thunderclap in the court, but it was the echo that held its power, a promised king banished, a crown passed aside, a household realigned. Those who felt the injustice most acutely were not only the exhausted servants who swept the floors of the palace, but also the mothers and bakers and guildmasters who had staked their futures on the steady rhythm of inheritance. Ayodhya began to keep its breath. Sita, in those days, was the light that steadied the exile. She left behind the pomp and the palatial gardens with a dignity that made the breeze itself hush. Her braid unbound not in despair but with purpose, and every step into the forest was a promise she made to another's need. The people who had once seen her weaving garlands and listening to the elders imagined her now among trees, moving like a shadow that still remembered the sun. The 3 who entered the forest, Rama, Sita, Lakshmana, carried different weights. Rama bore the weight of a vow and a quiet dignity, a man whose silence had become the language of kings. Sita carried the burden of love and the fierce clarity of a woman who would not be consigned to lesser things. Lakshmana carried the sting of protective fury, a brother whose devotion had the doggedness of a mountain stream cutting through rock. They settled in the dense stretches of the Dandaka forest, where the air thickened with the scent of damp earth and the slow rot of leaves. Deer moved with soft, sudden shifts, and the canopy stitched patterns of light and shadow across the trio as they made their modest hermitages. The forest, older than kingdoms, watched with the patience of trees, aware of comings and goings that human hearts would never fully understand. Yet the woods were not merely passive spectators, they were active players, full of listening branches and eyes that gleamed at dusk. Rama and Sita's life there was simple, almost spare, as if every extra thing had been pared away to reveal only essentials. They rose with the dawn and moved with a rhythm that matched the birds. Sita tended the hearth and wove, Rama walked the perimeter, training his mind and body to live within the law that had sent him there. The world they inhabited became a small and sacred circuit, one measured by the taste of wild fruits and the length of daylight. But even the most serene days carried the potential for rupture. Forests harbor their own politics, their own intrigues, and among the creatures and spirits were those who listened to the world like hungry people listen for bread. Shurpanakha, the fierce sister of Ravana, came into this story as someone who could not abide simplicity inside her bones. She saw Rama and Sita, and in that seeing she felt something sharp, a need that did not translate into gentle language. Shurpanakha's approach was abrupt and impulsive, an eruption in the quiet. When she proposed herself to Rama and then to Lakshmana, the scene became a study in contrasts, a woman emboldened by desire confronting two men who answered with courtesy turned to refusal. The refusal was not merely personal, it was a collision of worlds. Pride responded with wounded force, and in her wounded pride Shurpanakha reached for vengeance. Her plea and then her rage set off a chain of small catastrophes. In the exchange that followed, Lakshmana, seeing threat to his sister-in-law, lashed out in protection and cut off Shurpanakha's nose and ears. The wound was dramatic, a crimson punctuation in the green hush of the forest, and it altered the trajectory of many lives. Humiliated and outraged, Shurpanakha fled to her brother Ravana with the taste of revenge sharp in her mouth like iron. Ravana's domain was far across the water, the island of Lanka, a place of gold and labyrinths, of towers that caught the light like mirrors. He had his own grandeur, a king whose shadow stretched long over his people. Hearing of the woman who had been so forcibly refused only fanned the flames in his mind. But it was not a simple response. The encounter with Sita became for him a fixation that mingled desire with the complex politics of honor and insult. Maricha, the cunning magician and a servant of Ravana, was set upon a dangerous path by his master. He transformed himself into a golden deer on Ravana's command and moved through the forest like an offering wrapped in light. The deer was beautiful in a way that suggested a trap. It pranced where Sita could see it and where Rama could not help but notice. Desire for the graceful animal tugged at Sita the way a song tugs at a listener who cannot help but lean in. Sita's plea to Rama to capture the deer was soft, and in that softness lay the last fragile tether tying them to a normal life of wonder. Rama, aware of the deer's strangeness, nevertheless let compassion and curiosity guide him. He sent Lakshmana to protect Sita and chase the animal, and the narrative threaded itself into the inevitable. The forest held its breath, watching as a plan composed in Lanka unfolded with the slow precision of a net being drawn tight. Chasing the golden deer down winding paths and into deeper trees, Rama revealed the presence of a larger stratagem. Maricha, trained in illusion, mimicked Rama's voice to call for help at a distant bend of the forest. The cry sounded like Rama's, and in that voice Sita heard her husband's urgent danger. A singular sound can move the heart as neither sight nor reason can, and Sita's voice then called upon Lakshmana to help. Lakshmana's departure was the point at which trust and duty collided. He left Sita with a few protective words and a line drawn in the sand, a subtle ritual to mark boundaries that he expected to be respected. He told her to remain inside the shelter and to step out only with reason enough to bring Rama back beside her. Yet human hearts are not mechanized instruments of will, and Sita's inner turbulence braided with the sounds of danger to create a fearful impatience. Rama's pursuit, meanwhile, led him to Maricha, who, using his horn of deception, forced out a final, eerie cry in the tone of Rama's voice. The sound of Rama in supposed distress shattered the calm among those who loved him. Sita, hearing that faltering call, felt the ground tilt beneath the certainty of her life. The man and woman in the forest could no longer move under the same certainties as before. The command that Lakshmana left, a line, a protection, a small right, was broken by a moment's doubt. Sita, alone, stepped out of the shelter to look for her husband and to prove that she needed him alive and not just present. The world is full of such tiny, fatal decisions, choices that seem sensible in one frame and disastrous in the next. Her step out of the door, into the shadow and then the light, made her visible in the wrong way to the wrong eyes. That visibility was the precise thing Ravana craved. He had already fashioned a plan to abduct Sita, and he executed it with the regal cruelty that marked him. Disguised as a wandering ascetic, he came to Sita's cottage and spoke in tones meant to disarm. When Ravana revealed himself, the force of his will moved like a storm. Sita, maintaining her dignity, refused him. The refusal ignited in him a violent elevation into fury, and in that fury he enacted his will with the single-mindedness of a disaster. Ravana's abduction of Sita was not merely the physical removal of a person from place to place. It was an upheaval of story, of promise, of the small moral scaffolding upon which both families and kingdoms rest. Sita was carried through the air like a living standard torn from the field in a moment of war. The sight of her taken from the groves was a wound felt in many bodies, in Rama's crumpled silence, in Lakshmana's helplessness, and in the hush that later descended on Ayodhya when the news crossed plains and rivers. There was violence in the abduction, but it was not the only language spoken that day. Sita fought with words as deftly as with will. She addressed Ravana with the sort of calm reproof that could unnerve tyrants. She reminded him of his duties, of the law of kings and the cost of breaking women as if they were toys. Her voice, clear and acerbic at once, carved a space of dignity even as she was removed farther and farther from what she regarded as home. Rama's immediate response was a grappling, animal grief. He ran until the forest bent under the speed of his steps, until his breath became a metallic edge in the air. He found traces, the torn leaves, the broken twigs, the signs of a struggle inscribed on the earth. Each clue was a small compass pointing to loss, and Rama read them as if truth were a map, as if sorrow were at once a teacher and a taskmaster. Lakshmana's fury was different, edged with guilt and with regret for the rules he had broken in leaving Sita. He saw in the empty clearing the cost of his momentary judgment when he had obeyed the voice that mimicked his brother. He struck the earth with the same energy he might have used against an enemy, and then realized such force could not bring back what had been spirited away. Their grief took different shapes but remained the same in its depth. The forest itself responded. Jatayu, the great vulture and an old friend to Rama's family, tracked the abduction like a distressed wind. He could not abide the injustice of a woman being taken, and he dove into the scene with a valor that belonged to a time when birds and men shared the language of duty. In the battle that followed, Jatayu fought Ravana with the kind of dignity that makes small tragedies monumental, and though he was mortally wounded, his heart was heavy with the knowledge that he had tried. Rama and Lakshmana found Jatayu as he lay dying, his wings like spent banners, his voice a crack of warning. The bird told them what he had seen, and in that last telling he became a bridge between the forest's grief and the desperate human resolve that followed. Jatayu's wounds and his story were an early ledger of the cost that would be counted and recounted. His flight ended in sacrifice, and the path to action was now absolute and clear. The search that followed the abduction stretched out in every direction like a net cast wide. Rama and Lakshmana questioned travelers and hunters, they read signs and listened to the land, and the emptiness where Sita had been lived like a visible bruise on their days. In a world that still believed in omens, they took the counsel of sages and ascetics, and the sage Agastya reminded them of a world beyond the forest's edge, a realm of kingdoms and of sea-bound dangers. The path of vengeance suddenly required alliances that had to be built on trust and on the ability to read loyalties. News of the abduction reached Ayodhya in waves, and the city dimmed as it listened. Mothers folded their hands and tightened their shawls. Men paused mid-task and leaned toward the traveling messenger as if the act of listening could absorb the pain conveyed in a voice. The event in the forest became something happening in the marrow of the city, not simply a distant calamity. The thing that happens to a family often becomes a story painted across the faces of strangers. The impact in Ayodhya was complicated by previous fractures. Kakei's demand had already been a rupture, and people could not easily recompose themselves into their old certainties. The memory of a king sent into a silent grief, of a crown denied, sat with the newer wound of Sita's abduction like two cauterized sores that still bled under any pressure. Dreams of a secure succession were now tentative. The town looked smaller and more fragile than it had in the past. The comfort that order once gave was gone and had been replaced with the realization that fragile loyalties could be broken by a single knot of deceit. Rama's journey then broadened into a lesson about scale and reach. He would need to cross seas and cross social boundaries, to speak with monkeys and fishermen and exiles, to paint a coal-black map of a villain's domain and to find the right friends to cross it. He built alliances in unexpected places, and the alliances themselves told a story about the permeability of power. The men and creatures he met were not mere footnotes in his biography. They were characters with histories, grudges, and loves of their own. Sugriva, the monkey prince, appeared as one of those essential alliances. He had been betrayed by his brother and robbed of his kingdom, a figure whose own exile made him recognizable to Rama. There was a politics in lending help. Sugriva asked for Rama's support in regaining a throne, and Rama had reasons to see value in his offer. Their agreement was a turning point. Rama's cause was given the muscle it lacked in the form of an army that could see across treetops and fly. The problem of a single abduction now demanded a war that would encompass his oceans and moral geographies. Hanuman emerged from this gathering as a marvel, both fierce and tender, a learner who could be equal parts spy and devotee. He was sent ahead to find Lanka and speak with Sita if possible, and his leap across the sea became the stuff of incredulous tales. Yet the most telling part of Hanuman's mission was not his size or his leap, but his devotion, the ardor that formed a tether between a messenger and his lord. In loyalty's presence the world seemed to reframe itself, and what had been impossible became inevitable. Hanuman found Lanka and made his way through a city that glittered with an architecture built to intimidate. He saw Ravana's palace and read its arrogance like a blight on the shore. Yet it was Sita he sought, and in discovering her he found a woman who had aged in soul though not in youth, who had held herself with the honor of one whose heart was unyielding. His approach was tender and deliberate. He understood that deliverance often begins with bearing witness rather than with action alone. Sita's reception of Hanuman was a delicate thing. She tested him first, unsure of any stranger and of the danger that might follow even a hopeful face. Once convinced, she entrusted Hanuman with a small token, a sign that he could carry back to Rama, a ring, a testament of identity and of a promise still intact. Hanuman's return, ring in hand, became the hinge of hope upon which the next great conflict turned. The sight of that token reinstated a continuity between the vanished and the waiting, between abduction and rescue. Ravana's reaction as his islands buzzed with spies and with the rumor of an approaching army was a mirror of arrogance and fear. He sought to consolidate his power, to cement his image as invincible and as right. Yet within his own circle there were cracks. Vibhishana, his brother, argued for a path that respected righteousness over raw appetite. Brothers arguing over ethics is as old as humanity itself, and here it became the thin crack through which Dharma might one day find light. In the tense days that followed, Ravana's court became a stage of threat and miscalculation. He made choices not merely of personal desire, but as acts that would shape the fate of dozens of kingdoms and millions of lives. He miscalculated the strength of devotion and loyalty that bound Rama to allies. He mistakenly believed that gold and terror were sufficient instruments of obedience. Those errors grew like fungus in the dark, muffling the sound of more gracious alternatives. As armies gathered and strategies were drawn, the world seemed to contract to a single axis of vengeance and rescue. Rama's forces massed with the odd and honorable company of monkeys, bears, and men who had been pulled out of obscurity by the grandeur of a just cause. There were engineers and boats and the pragmatic will to build a bridge across the sea. The building of that bridge became a symbol of collaborative effort, an emblem of the way disparate peoples could unite under the banner of justice. The actual battle against Lanka was a series of vivid confrontations, each marked by moments of heroism and of quiet tragedy. Warriors on both sides fought with a conviction that often blurred the line between duty and fury. The war tested loyalties, exposed sordid calculations, and also proved the profundity of self-sacrifice. Many died, many more were wounded by ideologies that had outgrown their usefulness. Yet among all the clamor, the quest to restore Sita remained the central and shaping narrative. When at last Sita and Rama were brought back together after the fall of Ravana, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Their reunion was not merely a meeting of two bodies but the restoration of a story through it. There was a stillness as if the world recognized a moral unbroken by time. But reunions in epic tales are rarely clean or simple. Layers of suspicion, trial, and consequence still laced the end of that particular chapter. Sita's return did not come with all doors opened and all wounds healed. Even inside the palace, the need to confirm truth and propriety drove men to demand proofs that were painful and humiliating. It is a cruel paradox of human society that even victims are sometimes asked to prove their virtue in ways that compromise the dignity of survival. The fire ordeal, Agni's testimony, was one such ritual, a blazing demonstration meant to reject doubt and validate her purity in the most literal of flames. The fire ordeal was not only a test, but a performance of the era's moral logic, a logic that sought to reconcile personal trauma with public honor. Sita walked into that hearth with the kind of courage that turned the path of a survivor into a defiant act of reclamation. She came out unscathed, and to many that was sufficient. The flames, which might have been intended to consume, instead cannily became a witness to an untouchable truth. Yet not all observers accepted the spectacle at face value, and doubts lingered like smoke after a fire. News of these dramatic events moved across the plain back to Ayodhya, where the people's memory of what they had lost slowly unfolded into a larger political calculus. A kingdom must not only be governed but must be seen to be just and strong. The restoration of Rama to his throne required more than a seat on a bench. It needed the acceptance of the populace, the dignified nod of neighbors, and the removal of a pall that had settled over daily life. The world judges leaders not only by what they reclaim but by what they do to restore the moral order that binds a community. The shadow that Sita's abduction cast over Ayodhya did not lift with her return. The city carried a kind of permanent memory, an internal mapping of what had been lost and what remained uncertain. People began to ask harder questions about leadership and about the vulnerabilities of even the most sacred households. They questioned the structures that allowed such tragedies to occur, and those questions seeded reforms and new anxieties alike. Even when kings restored their thrones, their realms were altered in subtle and irreversible ways. One of the more enduring consequences of the episode was the way it complicated ideas of honor and justice in the public imagination. In the quiet of the palace chambers, decisions about embarrassment and proof and reparation were complicated by public reputations and private remorse. The demands of dharma, of right action, sat uneasily beside the raw human need to find root and safety. These tensions became a kind of moral architecture that would shape the stories of generations who listened to the tale and attempted to extract the law from its emotional chaos. The abduction itself has been retold in countless versions, each emphasizing a different moral turn or human failing. To some narrators, the story is chiefly about the dangers of desire and pride, and therefore about the slippery slope from a single act of want to a cascade of violence and loss. To others, the tale is a study of loyalty, of the devotion that can animate miracles and munitions alike. Each retelling is a light turned on a different wall of the same vast room, and the shadows that appear change shape depending on the angle of the beam. The figure of Ravana remains complex in public memory, a man who possessed staggering intellect and devotional faith as well as a monstrously vindictive appetite. He builds palaces and he learns scriptures, he listens to poets and he commits acts of violent hubris. The dissonance between Ravana's erudition and his choices is precisely what keeps scholars and storytellers occupied. It is as though the human capacity for beauty is sometimes braided inexorably with the capacity for destruction, and the result is a character both terrifying and sympathetic in equal measures. Equally complex is Sita as a figure in the imagination. She is honored for her constancy and chastity, yet she is also criticized by some traditions that ask hard questions about the fairness of the tests she endures. Her endurance becomes emblematic of a broader spiritual patience, a refusal to let the self be defined by violation. But the price of that endurance is heavy, and her story remains a recipe for debates about autonomy and justice. To say her name is to launch into a chorus in which duty, love, and agency chorus together and sometimes contradict one another. The fallibility of those entrusted with protection also becomes a recurrent theme. Lakshmana's single, crucial error was an echo in many later arguments about human responsibility. Was his leaving justified by the pressure of the call, or was it a failure that should have been prevented? The question is not merely historical or narrative, it is moral and psychological. Families and societies keep such examples close as reminders that protection is a burden that can be misread, misapplied, or misplaced. Beyond individuals, structural reflections emerge. The way Ayodhya responded and reassembled itself after these events speaks to the resilience and fragility of social systems. The maintenance of civil order depends on trust, and trust is hard-won but easily lost. When catastrophes strike, people judge institutions by how they behave in the moments of repair. They ask whether the laws and rituals that govern them are instruments of justice or mere theater. The Ramayana's episodes nudge listeners to consider the line between law and compassion, between punishment and restoration. This moral ambiguity gives the tale its long shelf life. It is not a didactic text that offers simple recipes for living, but a living conversation about what it means to hold to a principle when the principle counters intimate human needs. The abduction of Sita, more than being a single episode, becomes an ethical laboratory where motives are dissected and consequences are traced through generations. Listeners find in it not a map to a certain life, but a reflection of the kinds of choices that make up any life. The figure of Ayodhya itself evolves in these readings. It is not a background but a protagonist whose contours change depending on how its citizens respond to crisis. Some see Ayodhya as a microcosm of kingship, a place where the fate of the many is tied to the purity of the few. Others read it as an early experiment in constitutional crisis, where the lines of succession and right are tested publicly. The city's myths and memories become a scaffolding for public imagination, a way for communities to talk about law, loyalty, and the cost of mistakes. Religion and politics interlace throughout the narrative, sometimes harmonizing and sometimes clashing. Rituals like the fire ordeal exist side by side with the pragmatic demands of governance. People debate whether faith provides a compass or a cudgel. The narration of Sita's abduction forces listeners to confront the ways ritual can both comfort and confound, strengthen and obscure. In every retelling, there is a refusal to let the conclusion be tidy. In the larger sweep of the Ramayana, This abduction becomes a hinge not only for the characters but for the landscape of values. It shapes the way subsequent rulers imagine their relationship to law and to the governed. Kings who take lessons from Rama may emphasize humility and the importance of moral restraint. Others may read different lessons and emerge more authoritarian, seeing strength as the sole bulwark against disorder. Thus the event's meaning is never settled. It radiates outward like ripples on a pond that never quite stills. Human pain, grief, and the stubbornness of love remain the emotional core around which the story swings. Rama's sorrow is not a background detail but the engine of action. It fuels alliances and campaigns, and it redraws the moral map until it points toward rescue. Sita's sufferings and her steadfastness produce not only pity but also a paradoxical reverence, an acknowledgement of the human capacity to endure both indignity and devotion. And Lakshmana's vigilance and remorse speak of the thin line between protection and failure. The shadows that fell across Ayodhya continue to be discussed in songs and at hearths long after the dust of war settled. Bards and mothers retold the tale in ways that suited their particular needs, as caution, as inspiration, as a meditation on the cost of pride. Each retelling shifted emphasis, adding ornaments of local custom or ethical concern. The story, like all great narratives, became a social mirror that reflected back the society's values and its blind spots. Even today, centuries later, the abduction of Sita holds the attention of scholars, poets, philosophers, and ordinary listeners. The tale has been retranslated and reimagined in countless languages and forms, and it persists precisely because it refuses closure. It is both a story of a woman's resilience and of the broader social dynamics that can either protect or endanger the vulnerable. Each generation reads something anew into the fabric of the story, and in doing so they remake it in their own moral image. It is tempting to say the abduction is a horror that finally resolves into a righteous victory. But such neatness denies the complexity that the tale insists upon. Victory brings with it costs, suspicion, ritual humiliation, and the mental remnants of suffering that cannot simply be erased. The story invites listeners to inhabit those tensions rather than to escape them with the consolation of a single moral. It demands that we carry contradictions as if they were relics, wholly precisely because they resist simple explanations. Listening to this story while driving through a modern highway, one might find the images bleeding into the everyday, the solid lanes like the border of a palace garden, the trees and wires like the forest canopy, the speed and isolation echoing the loneliness of exile. The narrative bridges centuries, not merely in plot but in mood. It suggests that human dilemmas remain constant: how to protect loved ones, how to exercise power without becoming enslaved by it, how to balance private justice with public law. The abduction of Sita remains more than myth. It is an ongoing conversation about the kind of society people want to live in. When communities argue about who stands for what, they are, in part, arguing about characters like Rama and Sita and Ravana. They are testing whether their laws preserve dignity or compound suffering. This is why the tale returns again and again, not because it settles debates, but because it makes people think of them anew. The shadow that fell over Ayodhya was neither purely metaphysical nor purely literal. It was a complex of consequences that touched agriculture, succession, ritual practices, and interpersonal trust. It changed how people spoke about kings and how they framed the relationship between ruler and subject. The city learned that a single act, committed far from its walls, could unbalance its moral economy for generations. In the end, the abduction of Sita teaches us about the unexpected magnitude of small acts. The pulling of a veil, the leaving of a post, the speaking of a false voice, any of these can reroute the lives of thousands. That lesson resonates today, across new technologies and shifting polities, because the architecture of human relationships remains stubbornly the same. We meet small choices every day, and our collective history is the ledger of their outcomes. Rama's eventual return to Ayodhya and the re-establishment of his rule did not erase the memory of loss. People worshipped at shrines and performed rituals of repair, but the narrative of suffering lingered. The city had to reconcile the mythic perfection of its leader with the human compromises necessary to maintain peace. This reconciliation required a level of mature imagination, the capacity to hold two truths at once, that heroism is real and that it is indivisible from a web of human frailty. Stories like these survive because they give people language for sorrow and for determination. The tale of Sita's abduction is a way of talking about what it costs to live with honor and to fight for it when the world goes wrong. It is a reminder that even the purest motives may find themselves entangled in the messy machinery of social life. The narrative becomes a tool for empathy. When you listen to Sita, you learn a vocabulary for endurance. When you listen to Rama, you learn how grief can be a spur to action. When the sun set on the battlefield and the last of the dust settled in the palaces, Ayodhya remained, changed but breathing. The city had absorbed lessons under the weight of pain and had learned, painfully, the complexity of rule. It had gained new stories to recite over hearths and new caution in its leaders' hearts. And for those who had seen the events unfold, each breath thereafter contained the memory of what had been lost and the fragile hope that some things might be made right again. The abduction of Sita stands as a caution about the fragility of dignity and the enormous effort required to restore it. It exposes the limits of power and the ways human desire can bend stature into ruin. Yet it also honors the resilience of those who stand firm against violation, of friends who gather in the face of injustice, and of communities that eventually choose to reweave trust. These are the strands that hold the epic together and keep it alive in the human imagination. Listening to this ancient story, one senses that its power is not located in any single character but in the relational web they form. Each participant changes because of the others. The abduction is a pivot around which the arc of loyalty, betrayal, honor, and love turns, and it forces listeners to consider how they would act if placed in a similar web. That reflective capacity is perhaps the tale's most enduring gift. It asks not only to be heard but to be internalized and to alter actions in the world beyond the story. Few stories teach as clearly how private events become public tragedies. The abduction begins as a private crime but escalates into a national moral emergency. The public response is not merely for spectacle, it is the necessary mechanism by which a society calibrates its norms. The Ramayana invites its audiences to imagine themselves as part of that mechanism, as citizens whose choices shape the moral arc of their communities. Decades after the event, the scar it left remained visible in rituals and in legal pronouncements, in songs and in quiet prayers. People spoke of the time when a woman was taken and a kingdom responded, and in doing so they taught their children lessons about vigilance, mercy, and justice. Myths like this thus become living instruction manuals, not because they provide strict code but because they provoke ongoing moral dialogue. In the telling and retelling, they remain relevant and alive. Ravana's defeat, though decisive, did not magically repair everything that had been broken. It did not erase the pain inflicted on Sita nor the humiliation she endured. It did not remove the doubt that had lodged in the hearts of many observers. But it did show that justice, when pursued with the right allies and guided by a steady moral compass, could be enacted even in the face of monstrous power. The resolution, imperfect as it was, signaled that the social order had the resources to fight back against transgression. Perhaps the most poignant lesson of the episode is that moral clarity is rarely absolute. Even heroes make mistakes, even villains have redeeming qualities. The story invites a patient sympathy for complexity. It offers a space where certainty yields to the need to listen, to judge carefully, and to act compassionately. In a world conditioned toward black and white judgments, this insistence on nuance becomes an act of civil courage. The shadow over Ayodhya, then, is not only a cautionary tale about the fragility of order and the ease with which desire can transmute into disaster. It is also a reminder of the human capacity for reconstruction. The city that once trembled gradually learned new meanings of justice. The people who had once watched their prince go into exile and their queen be taken away found a way to weave social life anew, with scars and with wisdom. The story returns to us time and again because it teaches how to live with imperfection and yet strive for better. As years fold into centuries, the abduction of Sita remains a moral and emotional lodestone. It is used in sermons and in classrooms, in songs and whispered counsels. It continues to stir debate precisely because it resists a single reading. Long after the palaces crumble and the armies are nameless, the fundamental question persists: how does a society best protect dignity without sacrificing justice? The Ramayana does not give a single answer, but it gives stories that keep the question alive. So the narrative circles back to its beginning, to the subtle truth that history often begins with small decisions. A ring left at a door, a cry mistaken for the voice of a loved one, the arrogance of a king who believes he can seize what does not belong to him, these are the seeds of the whole tragedy. Yet from such seeds also grow the qualities that rebuild: alliance, sacrifice, loyalty, and the stubborn insistence on righting wrongs. The abduction of Sita thus remains a story of loss and of the labor required to reclaim honor in a fragile world. To hear the story now is to be asked to hold many images at once: the gentle domesticity of palace life, the wildness of the forest, the monstrous appetite of a proud king, the loyalty of friends who cross seas and battlefields, and the tragic dignity of a woman who refuses to be defined by violation. These images coexist as pieces of a moral mosaic that refuses simplification. Each element teaches a different lesson, and together they form an argument for the importance of moral imagination in public life. The shadows that fell upon Ayodhya were not merely dark, they were instructive. They taught leaders and citizens alike to measure power not just by its ability to conquer, but by its capacity to preserve dignity. They taught that the cost of failing to protect the vulnerable is a tax paid in generations of distrust. And they taught that those who love must sometimes cross impossible distances, not simply to restore, but to recreate the conditions that make home possible. In those shadows lay lessons on how to rebuild the fragile architecture of social life. When one drives away from the story, with its images still fresh and its moral questions unresolved, the mind naturally returns to that stubborn truth: the story continues to matter because it demands responsibility. It asks each listener to consider how they might act when faced with injustice, how quickly they might abandon duty for convenience, and how they might become part of the web that protects or endangers the vulnerable. Such reflection keeps the narrative alive, not as memory but as active, ongoing counsel. And so the tale of Sita's abduction endures, not as an isolated act of cruelty isolated in time, but as an event that reshaped a kingdom's moral geography. It remains a lesson on how desire and pride can corrupt the best of times, and how devotion and courage can lead to extraordinary rescue. Those contradictions are the essence of its power, and they make the story a living document for those who wish to understand how communities fall apart and how they might stitch themselves together again. If there is a final irony in the story, it lies in the fact that what was intended to break a woman instead made her a symbol of endurance for countless hearts. What ravaged the kingdom revealed the limits of human power and the surprising strength of human solidarity. And what seemed like an irretrievable loss eventually became a testament to the capacity for moral repair. In the end, Ayodhya stood as both a city touched by sorrow and a place where lessons of governance and of humanity were learned and relearned, generation after generation. To listen to the tale of Sita's abduction is to enter into a long conversation about how to balance desire, duty, justice, and love. It is to be reminded that history is not only made by those who hold crowns but also by those who refuse to yield their dignity. The story asks us to keep asking questions rather than to accept easy absolutes, and in that insistence it offers a form of hope that the moral imagination can be strengthened by careful attention to the past and that societies can learn from the shadows that fall across them. The sea lay between them like a deliberate silence, a vast, blue expanse that separated the world of exile from the citadel of power. Rama stood at the edge of the shore, his bow balanced in a steady hand, watching the nightly shimmer where stars and water met and seemed to promise a road. Behind him, an army as improbable as the sea itself had gathered, monkeys and bears and humans, their faces lit with resolve and the slow-burning hope that had carried them from the forests to this brink. The air smelled of salt and iron and the quiet kinds of prayers men and beasts offer before a storm of war. Across the water, Lanka rose like a city shaped by fire and pride, its golden towers catching light in arrogant flashes. Ravana's palace was a jewel that had been polished by conquest, crafted from the skill and vanity of a king who believed himself untouchable. To reach that gleaming heart, Rama knew, would mean walking through a history of wrongs turned into defenses, and every gatekeeper would be a memory turned into steel. He breathed in the hushed resolve of men prepared to make right what had been said wrong, and felt the weight of Dharma settle like armor on his shoulders. The bridge across the sea, Nala's bridge, they called it, was less a feat of engineering than of collective will. Stones that were names and oaths, carried moment by patient hand, sank and floated and seemed to answer a tacit promise as Nala and Neela led the building with laughter and song. The bridge grew like faith itself, a narrow artery of purpose across the indifferent sea, and each step taken by the vanguard echoed like a beat in a drum of destiny. When they set foot on the path to Lanka, the army moved as if the earth itself had turned to welcome them, and the sea relinquished its boundary. Rama's mind was never far from Sita, her absence braided his focus and his fury. He had sought justice, but what he would retrieve at the end of this battle could not simply be a person returned. The substitution of war for waiting had complicated the simple geometry of longing into the many-sided calculus of duty, honor, and consequence. Still, the sight of the enemy ramparts made grief into a sharpening tool, cutting away hesitation and doubt. Vibhishana's defection was a slow, inward tremor that finally became a determined step onto Rama's side. He came not as a conqueror's ally but as a brother who had seen the cruelty in kinship and chosen another law to follow. His knowledge of Lanka's defenses, walls that opened when certain horns sounded, towers that gaped open to swallow the unwary, secret caches of soldiers trained to spring like spearflowers, became the lantern that lit a path through a darkened fortress. Yet the offering of counsel from that inner court carried its own sting. To accept it was to accept the betrayal of blood, and to reject it would be to refuse an inroad into the enemy heart. Night fell on the causeway to Lanka as if reluctant to interrupt a march already laden with fate, and the army made camp in the bones of the newly created road. Fires were lit, and the playwrights of the troupe, old monkeys who had known other sieges, spoke of strategy with a reverence reserved for spells. Rama listened, but he also spoke, and when he did, his words were precise and like arrows in their measure. He reminded them that this war was not hunger for the land but hunger for rightness, and that their weapons would need to be tempered by righteousness if what they sought was to last beyond victory. The first clashes on Lankan soil were reconnaissance given a sharp edge. Scouts, light as deer, slipped into the city and tested its echoes, drawing out watchful responses that turned into the first true battles. Spears hissed in alleyways and wings of Naga sentinels combed the night sky above, and in those hours the city seemed to breathe like a living beast, each beat a test of who would be first to strike and last to stand. The smaller engagements were brutal, intimate. the kind of combat where an opponent learns the shape of another's courage by the sound of his breathing. Ravana watched the smoke of the frontier with a monarch's measured interest, and in his chambers he summoned the ancient chants that made celestial beings tremble. He was no ordinary foe. Born of a lineage steeped in both piety and peril, Ravana had been granted boons that embroidered his body with invulnerability, and his intellect was a coiled weapon of its own. He read the omens as a man reads the lines on his hand, confident that his blessings would shield him from the justice he had sown. Yet his confidence was, in truth, a tapestry threaded with the same mortal fears all kings carry: the fear of being toppled, the fear of leaving no memory but cruelty. The battlefield itself became a theater of opposites. Rama's army held a steady, flowing order like a river, while Lanka's defenders were a series of sparks, sudden and fiery. The monkeys leapt with an agility and reckless devotion that unmoored Lanka's sense of security. Elephants charged like moving walls, their trumpets a language of doom that shook the ground. Carefully trained forces of Rakshasas moved with a practiced lethality, diving from parapets and hurling themselves into the fray with a savagery born of a life raised to defend a palace of blood. Each encounter was a conversation in violence, a debate where the loudest argument was force. In the chaos of early battles, heroes emerged without fanfare and legends reasserted their claims. Engadha, Sugrava's son, fought with the kind of raw, faithful strength that made even the most battle-hardened pause in recognition. Jambavan, ancient and slow to anger, struck with a weight that seemed to carry the wisdom of epics. His blows were like history itself, slow and inexorable. Hanuman, who had once crossed the sea like a thought and burned a city with a single incendiary moment, now fought with a steadiness that mixed mischief and mercy. These were not just individual champions but embodiments of a force that war cannot smother. Devotion turned to duty. As the days lengthened into a campaign, the strategies grew intricate and the air around the city thrummed with spells and counterspells. Ravana countered the overt push with cunning ambushes and the deployment of magical weapons that bent light and wind. Some of his sons and generals were no mere footnotes. Indrajit, whose name means conqueror of Indra, used stealth and the dark arts of warfare to strike when no sound foretold his coming. He fought like a thought that could not be pinned down, weaving invisibility and illusion into a form of combat that haunted the defenders as much as it harmed them. Every time Indrajit fell into battle and rose again with some new stratagem, the hearts opposing him thudded with a rhythm of dread and respect. There were moments when a single duel could seem to contain the war's entire logic. Rama and Ravana never sought to meet until the city had been softened by attrition, but their warriors clashed in ways that mimicked the height and depth of their convictions. Battles were fought on hillocks and in courts, along rivers and beneath archways gilded with the carved stories of ancient gods. Heroes on both sides traded blows and words, and sometimes blows became part words, speech translated into steel. Those exchanges revealed the human layer under the armor: fear, pride, regret, the ache for glory or understanding. Rama's arrows were never merely instruments of destruction. Each was launched with a small liturgy, a breath of recollection of a promise made. He invoked the memory of vows, of fathers and teachers, of the riverless nights spent with insulated thought. In the bow's tension and release, there was the unspoken history of righteousness that had birthed an entire ethic of conduct. Opposing arrows carried countervows, and between them flew the language of hate and justice, a volley of meanings as much as hurt. Ravana's personal might did not manifest only on the battlefield but in the morale of his troops. He was a king who could inspire belligerence, make his soldiers feel that they defended a cosmic right, not merely a palace. His generals, steeped in the belief of their master's destiny, fought with a fanaticism that was terrifying to behold. Yet that same fervor often masked a brittle conviction. The more a king is certain of his sanctity, the more fragile that sanctity can become when struck by truth. The siege of Lanka turned physical features into strategic tools. Towers were breached and refortified, and canals once meant to cool palaces were redirected into moats and traps. Siege engines of imaginative design groaned and spat, their builders finding ways to convert veins of prayer into devices of war. Every construction taught both sides a lesson about adaptability. War here was an engineering contest braided with myth, ingenuity meeting raw vigor in the temple courtyards and marketplace lanes. Midway through the war, the battle shifted into a night of masked horrors and splendid courage known as the Night of Arrows. Under a moon that made the city glow like a bowl of molten silver, archers on both sides released volleys that turned the sky into a net. In that hour, death came with a strange intimacy. An arrow that flew could have been launched at a face known or a shadow unknown. The soldiers learned, one by one, the face of resolve under fire, and the night grew thick with the small, human sounds of men making decisions that would mark the rest of their lives. Kumbhakarna, Ravana's giant brother, brought into battle an elemental force that altered the landscape of combat. When he rose, it was as if a mountain walked, his deep bellow a change in the world's timbre. The earth itself seemed to sigh under his feet, and the monkeys felt their strategies collapse like paper houses against the wind. Yet Kumbhakarna fought with an old man's loyalty as much as with monstrous appetite, and in his defeat lay a tragedy that even a hardened warrior could not entirely ignore. Indrajit's return to the battlefield after each fall was like the resetting of a terrible instrument. He used secret mantras to summon celestial weapons, arrows that burned with the knowledge of gods and storms. At one point, he encircled Rama and Lakshmana in a celestial fire, a pranic cocoon of sorts, binding them to a fate that looked inexorable. The rescue that followed was not only martial but sacramental. Hanuman and his allies had to fetch water consecrated by gods and knowledge taught by sages, because some fires burn with a logic beyond the merely physical. Weapons in this war were given character by the names and incantations they carried. These weren't cold steel and wood but artifacts saturated with history, the Brahmastra that could level mountains, the Narayanastra that responded to devotion, the Pashupatastra that resonated with Shiva's terrible benevolence. Learning to use them was learning a new language, and using them badly could mean annihilation not only of flesh but of fate. Certain weapons required sacrifice to invoke, and that sacrificial quality made warriors pause. To pull a string was to pull time backward or forward in ways that would not easily be reversed. Healers and sages crowded the field like a moving monastery, tending wounds that were both psychic and bloodied. The wound of a son, the cut of a friend's armor, the bruise of trust betrayed, all required salves as much as sutures. They invoked herbs and chants and made pragmatic choices as a surgeon in the middle of storm. The battlefield became a hospital of souls as well as flesh, a place where mending depended on both ointment and old stories told again to steady shaken courage. The city itself became a witness to the war's moral dialogues. Markets were once places of buying and selling, now they held the barter of favors and loyalties. The temples, whose bells had once rung only for festivals and seasons, clanged warnings that tugged at devotees who were forced to worship under a different sky of smoke. Lanka's golden streets saw the transformation of civility into survival, and in that transformation the citizens learned the cost of living when rulers contend for destiny itself. Night after night, the army considered its losses and its lessons, while rainstorms alternated with surprisingly clear dawns. Rain made weapons slippery and turned trenches into rivers, but it also cooled the fever of anger long enough that men could remember why they had chosen to fight. Dawn brought back the clarity of purpose, the light showed ruin in true color and allowed compassion to persist in the midst of necessary cruelty. These cycles of weather seemed almost to serve as a rhythm for the hearts of those fighting, like the tides of the same sea that had opened a path to bring them there. Ravana's daughters and lesser nobles watched from the terraces, their faces a mixture of fear and anger and an attitude common to those who have been taught that their king cannot fail. Their cries when brothers fell were thunderous, and they too became part of the war, organizing defenses, singing war songs that turned into mourning, and at times stepping forward to fight. War, they learned, asked of everyone, and it spoke most directly to those who carried the least authority. Hanuman became the army's living emblem of intelligence operating within devotion. He performed feats of incredible strength and uncanny strategy with the dignity of a scholar and the heart of a child. His sprints across the battlefield were not merely for glory but for a series of precise tasks: to relieve a pressed flank, to carry news faster than any bird, to reckon the depth of a trench with a single leap. The way he could alternate fierce assault with the tender, almost filial, care for injured comrades made him a fulcrum upon which many a victory pivoted. Rama and Lakshmana shared a bond that war did more to reveal than to create. Their fighting together was choreography of mutual trust. One moved where the other had left a space, and every parry seemed to be the other's echo. They were fraternal in their steadiness, brothers in arms with a harmony so deep it made the ground feel less chaotic, as if somewhere the universe approved of their cause through the grace of their unity. To watch them was to see virtue in motion, a living argument that right action could have a kind of aesthetic beauty as well as ethical clarity. There were times when the war called for cunning rather than constancy of force. Decoys were made and false camps erected, and the army practiced patience like a discipline. Sometimes a small edge of the front would be sacrificed to lure a larger force into a trap. Sometimes silence would be the most devastating weapon of all. The leaders learned to measure the worth of a life against the life of the campaign, and those measurements were seldom clean or easy. The city of Lanka showed signs of a civilization under duress in ways that cut deeper than loss of life. Artisans hid in basements, their hands cramped from making weapons instead of ornaments. Musicians once paid to play in gilded halls learned to drum the rhythms of morale. The cultural heartbeat of the city changed its tune and forced inhabitants to harmonize with the new tempo of survival. On the field, Rama's restraint often spoke louder than any arrow he loosed. He had the fire of battle, but he was guided by a law that refused victory gained through means that would corrupt its ends. When faced with opportunities for immediate retaliation that would have cost innocents dearly, he chose instead paths that sustained his moral claim. That choice, while costly at times, insulated his victories with legitimacy. An unjust triumph would have hollowed out any kingdom he returned to. Ravana's psychology in war was complex, a weave of confidence, desperation, and a king's loneliness. He sent forth champions who were often his children, and their deaths were more than strategic losses. They were a softening in his armor that made a man visibly human. Yet he would not yield, and part of his resistance came from fear of the ashes his surrender would leave on his legacy. Sometimes, the more a ruler fears the loss of reputation, the more ferocious his final stand becomes. The final days of the siege took on the cadence of an unraveling fabric. Lanka's outer defenses gave way in slow sweeps and sudden rips, and Rama's forces multiplied their pressure with the rhythm of a well-played instrument. Ravana marshaled the last reserves with an intensity that turned the city's final moments into a spectacle both epic and intimate. The issues at stake felt cosmic and painfully immediate: a man seeking atonement for a theft of love, and a king attempting to defend his right to be feared. When Rama finally rode to the meeting with Ravana, it was not merely an encounter between two warriors but a conclave of fates. The confrontation carried in its silence the memory of Sita and the entire trajectory of a life spent in honoring promises. Words were exchanged as carefully as swords might have been, each sentence calibrated to the truth of things and the weight of consequence. Rama's forbearance had been deliberate, Ravana's obstinacy had been deliberate as well, and what remained now was the shape of an ending. The duel between Rama and Ravana was more than a clash of arms, it was a cosmic dialogue rendered in physical form. Each arrow Rama loosed carried meanings beyond damage, questions of duty, tests of resolve, and the echo of lineage. Ravana's counterattacks were a testimony to his power and the force of his convictions, and their exchange seemed to tilt the world into a new angle where morals were measured in breadth and timing. For those watching, the tension was a palpable thing, like a rope drawn taut between two ancient trees. Rama called upon weapons that were not merely made but invoked. There were mantras that lent arrows the pressure of the wind and names that summoned the memory of gods. The battlefield, in those moments, became a space where memory, prayer, and skill intersected, and the result was something that felt outside mere human struggle. Baptisms of flame and showers of celestial light turned the field into a theater of the sacred and the profane in the same stroke. Ravana's fall was both sudden and inevitable in the way that old structures sometimes crash when the final supporting beam gives. It was an end that reverberated like thunder. When the king at last let go of armor and arrogance, his body slumped and the city of Lanka seemed to inhale as if relieved. Yet relief was tempered by reflection. Ravana had been many things: a scholar, a devotee of Shiva, a terrible father, and an inexorable ruler. His death did not erase the complexity of his life, it made it more painfully visible. The immediate aftermath of Ravana's death was chaos braided with a fragile desire for order. Soldiers on both sides wept and shouted in the same breath, as if not knowing which of their instincts to honor first. Vibhishana walked among the streets and saw the city he had known as a court stripped of its illusions, and he felt both vindicated and heavy with the responsibility of building anew. Lanka had to be remade not only in its walls but in its law and conscience. The matter of Sita had to be settled even after the body and the crown had been taken from the conflict. Her ordeal and her loyalty had been one axis upon which this entire war had turned, and so her place at the end of the tale mattered as much as any battlefield triumph. The meeting between Rama and Sita carried its own rituals, the public, the private, the legal, and each was fraught with meanings small and large. They navigated questions of honor and trust, where the scales of public right and private pain had to be balanced with a kind of wisdom that war does not naturally cultivate. When the smoke settled and the last banners of conflict were folded, there was a slow return to life that felt almost fragile. Survivors rebuilt homes and relearned the business of being gentle to one another. The animals who had fought alongside human allies returned to tasks that were simpler by comparison: hunting, gathering, and telling younger ones about nights bright with terror and bravery. The threads of daily life stitched themselves back together, though some stitches would forever carry the dark color of loss. Rama's coronation in Lanka was an odd kind of closure, dignified, solemn, and in some ways incomplete. He had won a kingdom and he had recovered an honor, but the cost of both had been tallied in ways the mind still struggled to place. The audience that watched him take his place on a throne thought of the men who had fallen unseen and the beasts who had given themselves without counting cost. Triumph sat amid grief and prayer, an uncomfortable but truthful pairing. As the army began its return to Ayodhya, the bridge was left to the sea, and the memory of that crossing took on a mythic quality in the tales people would tell. Each step away from Lanka was a step into a different kind of responsibility. Rama would return not only as a hero but as a ruler with knowledge of war's toll. The journey home was slow and filled with stops that allowed grief to be spoken of and bravery to be honored in languages that would carry forward into peace. In the years that followed, stories of the war spread like a living fabric, embroidered with the names of those who had stood when it mattered. Minstrels and scholars debated the righteousness of acts committed in the fog of war, and temples were built to commemorate both victory and loss. People argued about whether the end had sanctified the means, and their descendants would keep those arguments alive because it is in such debate that societies remember their hard lessons. The War of Lanka, in the end, remained a narrative of the human condition writ large, pride met by humility, strength met by justice, and the possibility of redemption threaded through grief. It told of a time when the profound demands of duty required actions that were both terrible and necessary, and where victory meant more than capture. It left behind a city and an empire reformed, a king who had learned what it meant to govern with both firmness and compassion, and a legacy that would be retold in countless languages to anyone who needed a parable about the cost and the aim of righteous action. When the dust of battle finally settled and the fires of sacrifice cooled, the world held its breath as if listening for the footsteps of destiny. The Great War had been a clash of fates, a meeting of cosmic duties and human wills, and in its wake there was a silence that spoke of both loss and liberation. Trees that had stood through the uproar whispered among their leaves, animals moved cautiously back into their old paths, and the rivers seemed to wash themselves anew in the wake of so much upheaval. It was into that tempered stillness that Rama, the prince turned exile turned warrior, prepared to take his next steps toward home. Across the expanse of the sea, the bridge that had been wrought from faith and labor lay like a living promise between two shores. The stones and logs and roots that made the causeway carried the memory of every hand that had set them in place, and every foot that had crossed it. Vanera and human alike had come together under a single purpose, and in that unity the foundation for a return had been built. This bridge was more than architecture, it was testimony to what can be accomplished when duty and devotion intersect. Rama's mind, usually so steady and measured, held a quiet overflowing with memories. Each step carried an echo of the past, of the laughter of childhood in Ayodhya's palaces, of the simple meals shared beneath forest pavilions, of conversations by moonlight where vows had been made and tested. The faces of companions and the shadow of fallen foes moved through his thoughts with equal reverence, because to Rama the world had always been a mosaic of dharma and consequence. He walked with the weight of a people's hopes and the clarity of a king who had discovered what it truly meant to serve. Beside him walked Lakshmana, whose loyalty had been a constant like the northern star. Every glance he offered Rama held not only affection but a readiness to step into danger at a moment's notice, a vow that had not dimmed despite years of hardship. Lakshmana's arms had held friends and confronted enemies, and his heart bore both the grief of losses sustained and the quiet joy of duties fulfilled. Together they were more than brothers, they were living proofs that bonds can anchor even the most tempest-tossed lives. Hanuman, the tireless servant of devotion and mischief, moved with a grace that belied his immense strength. His mind, which had leapt across oceans and faced demons with a single bound, now softened into a kind of reverent observation. To him, the sight of Rama returning was the answer to a yearning he had carried like a flame, and that warmth spread outward as he greeted every comrade and stranger with tales of valor and hope. Where strength met reverence, Hanuman stood as a bridge between formidable power and childlike wonder. When the shores of Lanka receded from the rear and the familiar features of the kingdom they saw began to take shape on the horizon, a new tension threaded the air. This was not merely the thrill of approaching home, it was the apprehension that always laces a new beginning with tests. People expected triumph and celebration, but they also expected justice, healing, and the restoration of proper order. Rama understood that returning was an act that would require not only honor but also discernment. Vibhishana, who had chosen righteousness over kinship, remained a figure both welcomed and scrutinized. His decision to abandon his brother's cause had been a rupture in the world of loyalties, yet it was the sort of rupture that allowed truth to enter where blind allegiance once obstructed it. The trust extended to him by Rama and his allies was not naive, it was an active investment in the possibility that change can arise from unexpected places. Vibhishana accepted both the consolation and the burden of responsibility he had been given. As the flotilla of returning warriors approached the riverbanks and the mud of their homeland, the landscape itself received them with a slow, almost sovereign nod. Clusters of women and children who had known only anxious rumors now pressed closer to witness the faces of those who had come back. Old men and elders lifted their hands in blessing, and for a moment the distance between fear and relief seemed no wider than a single heartbeat. This was the hour when tales would revive and names would be stitched again into the fabric of a community. Sita's absence had been a constant ache throughout those years, an absence that shaped every conversation and every quiet pause. Her purity and strength had been the center of stories and longing alike, and people wondered what her presence would mean in the city that had once been her cradle. Rama carried in his mind not only the trials they had both endured but also the delicate balance between personal hurt and public duty. The return was a promise in which private sorrow might seek its resolution beneath a public sky. Pushpaka, the aerial chariot, cut a graceful silhouette across the heavens as it bore its passengers toward the capital. It was a vessel both enchanted and sober, a vehicle that seemed to understand the magnitude of its cargo, not merely triumphant heroes, but the fragile threads of a kingdom's moral fabric. The lotus-scented air within the chariot held quiet conversations and silent prayers in equal measure, and each mile it flew stitched the band of displacement tighter into the familiar skin of home. The city awaited, with its own rhythms and reckonings. Approaching Ayodhya, the spires and domes rose like questions that the returning king would have to answer. People lined the roads and rooftops, their faces bright with anticipation and tinged with the complexity of what it means to hope. Children who had grown during the years of exile looked up as if seeing a dream made real, and elders folded their palms in a gesture older than kingdoms. The air vibrated with 1,000 small breaths that added themselves to the one great suspense. Would the promise of the past be fulfilled in the present? Rama's arrival was met with a chorus that felt ancient and immediate at once. Drums rolled like the heartbeat of the earth, and flutes wove long, tender threads of melody through the crowd. Flowers rained from eager hands, their colors a bright testimony to the joy that can bloom after hardship. But amid the music and the rites there remained the sober truths that had followed Rama since the day he left, that rule must be just, that personal honor must be unblemished, and that the crown is earned by the weight of continued goodness. There were ceremonies that had been planned for the return, rituals that ordered joy into something sacred and public. Priests chanted, and lamps were lit in long rows that turned the streets into waterways of light. Every rite was an attempt to translate the enormous private sacrifices into a civic narrative everyone could share. Rituals do this work for communities. They transform individuals' trials into collective meaning so that the story of one life expands to become the story of all. The coronation itself was not merely a spectacle, it was an adjudication, a public affirmation that Rama's path had been true and that his return signaled a restoration of cosmic balance. He sat upon a throne that represented more than sovereignty, it symbolized the moral architecture a king must inhabit. As he donned the symbols of rule, each ornament and fold of cloth carried with it the weight of promises made and the expectations of a populace longing for just rule. This was the moment when the private and the public braided into governance. Rama's science of kingship was informed by the forest's austerity as much as by palace training. He had learned to rule by listening to the pulse of common life, by attending to both the softest cry and the loudest complaint. The exile had taught him restraint and compassion, and the war had taught him the rigor of judgment. He approached governance like a gardener returns to a field after a season of storms, with plans to repair, with patience to heal, and with a readiness to prune where necessary. There were voices that rose in praise and voices that nudged with caution. Public life is never a monolith, and the diversity of opinion within the city gave life to the tension of civic discourse. Some hailed the return as an unmistakable sign that darkness had been banished, while others insisted that vigilance must remain, for the seeds of chaos had been sown and could sprout again if left unattended. Rama heard them all, not as antagonists but as threads to be woven into a more resilient tapestry of rule. Healing the wounds of war meant more than rebuilding walls and houses. It meant reconciling families and restoring livelihoods. Soldiers returned to their own hearths with their own ghosts, and those ghosts required patient tending. Fields that had lain fallow needed the hands of farmers, and artisans needed markets restored. Rama's court labored to translate the exhilaration of victory into structures that could sustain ordinary life. For a king's highest triumph is to make the world safer and more fertile for the smallest and most ordinary tasks. Amid the administrative duties, there were moments of intimate human reckoning that demanded more than ceremony. The return brought with it reunions that had been imagined and reimagined in countless private prayers. Parents embraced children who had grown into strangers, and friends met with the awkward joy of those who have survived peril together. These small human collisions were the true measure of the return, because they proved that even after great disruption, life seeks to re-inhabit its former rhythms. Yet not all scars could be smoothed by the touch of celebration. The memory of fallen heroes hovered over the city like a mist that refused to dissipate. Monuments would be raised, names would be inscribed, and offerings would be made, but the loss remained immediate in the eyes of mothers and the silences of companions. Rama carried these absences within him as a ledger of sacrifice. He honored them with decrees to care for those left behind and with private moments of remembrance. A true victory, he knew, acknowledges its cost. Sita's return was a chapter that unfolded with delicate, almost unbearable attention. The city and the court watched with a scrutiny that sharpened the edges of every step she took. Her dignity had remained untouched in the eyes of those who loved her, but public gaze can make virtue into a fragile instrument, to be tested and tested again. Rama's love had been proven in war, but love must also survive the pressures of expectation and the tests of social order. Public trust requires more than faith, it requires certainty for the community. Rama, ever mindful of his duty to his people, was caught between his devotion as a husband and his obligation to the moral expectations of a king. Questions that probed private fidelity became matters of public consequence, for a king's house is not only a home but a reflection of the realm's moral order. The tension between personal compassion and public duty revealed that sometimes the path of righteousness is a narrow corridor between two unyielding walls. Trials and tests in the name of truth have a way of turning inward and outward at the same time. Sita faced inquiries not because Rama desired to hurt, but because the implicit contract between a sovereign and his subjects can demand clarity in places where the personal and public intersect. The process was painful and pained many who watched, because the rigors applied to the pure-hearted are always a paradox. One seeks to affirm their integrity while risking the harm that the seeking itself can inflict. The dilemma tested the hearts of many and reminded them that justice must be tempered with compassion. In quieter corridors away from public eyes, Rama and Sita shared moments that revealed the depth of their bond beyond the ceremony. These were not grand declarations but small, steady exchanges, a look that spoke of mutual steadiness, a hand taken in the dark, a memory of shared past comforts that no ruler could ever fully enumerate. The human heart insists on its own private geography even in the presence of responsibility, and those hidden maps gave both of them a refuge of tenderness. It was in these spaces that their relationship renewed its private life aside from its public meaning. As the realm stabilized, Rama extended his attention to the magistrates and ministers who would carry the work of governance forward. He insisted on integrity and on the painstaking calibration of laws to human needs. Punishments were to be just, punishments were to be proportionate, and the administration of law had to remain blind to favoritism. The king's hand is heavy when it must correct, but heavier still when it fails to do so and injustice takes root. Peasants and merchants came forward with their grievances and hopes, and the court listened with an unusual patience. For too often kings hear only the echo of the palace, but Rama made an effort to attend to the murmurs that rose from the bazaars and fields. Tax reforms were discussed with an eye toward fairness. Irrigation projects were planned with farmers' calendars in mind. The mundane work of improving infrastructure and removing bureaucratic obstacles became the palace's quiet heroism, for there is profound nobility in making life easier for the daily tasks of ordinary people. Stories of heroism that had erupted in the fires of war were retold and polished by the tongues of bards, whose voices both honored the past and shaped the memory of it. The deeds of Vanaras and Rakshasas, of soldiers and sages, entered the public imagination and became lessons for younger generations. Oral memory has the peculiar task of both celebrating and teaching, and the court encouraged stories that reminded citizens of the values that had carried them through. Through narrative, the triumph over evil transformed into a communal ethic for living well. The dynamic between ruler and subject took on an almost familial tone as the days passed, for Rama had always believed that governance must include the humbler sentiments of kinship. He walked among the people not to be seen but to see, to be present in markets and temples, and to make the palace less like an island. This walking itself became a form of governance, because seeing people's faces and hearing their daily tales shaped laws to be more humane. A king who walks is a king who knows where the kingdom aches. There were shores of diplomacy to mend as well, for the ripple effects of the war had been felt in neighboring kingdoms. Envoys arrived bearing both congratulations and caution, and Rama's response balanced magnanimity with prudent firmness. Treaties were re-examined and alliances recalibrated to ensure a lasting peace that did not depend solely on military might but on mutual respect and equitable trade. In this, Rama demonstrated that triumph over enemy armies is only the beginning of creating a sustainable peace between nations. The temple bells resumed their gentle cadence, marking the rhythms of festivals and harvests, and giving the city a sense of cyclical continuity. Religious life, nourished by ritual and devotion, helped steady a population that had been pulled apart and put back together again. People found solace in devotion and in the small consolations of daily rites. Faith, for many, rebuilt the synapses between suffering and meaning, offering a way to accept what had been lost and to work toward what could be restored. The seasons shifted from the monsoon's dramatic gestures into the quieter clarity of autumn, and with that seasonal change came a sense that the kingdom itself was shifting from crisis to normalcy. Crops sprouted, the market regained its bustle, and children ran through alleys with the unselfconscious abandon of new security. Nature, having its own calendar, seemed to approve of the slow recovery. The rhythms of the earth and the rhythms of the city found a new, if fragile, consonance. Rama's loyalty to Dharma, the moral law that guided his actions, took on new dimensions now that the immediate threats had been neutralized. Leadership required him to think longer term about the cultivation of virtues among his people. Schools and gatherings of learned men were encouraged so that principles of justice, duty, and compassion could be taught and debated. Wisdom, after all, is not a static inheritance but a living practice that needs to be cultivated in every generation. Monuments were not the only ways to remember the war. The living were asked to become stewards of the lessons it had taught. Veterans were given lands and positions where their skills could serve productive purposes, and communal rituals ensured that the sacrifices made were neither forgotten nor misplaced. The social contract between rulers and citizens was strengthened by these acts of public care, signaling that the triumph of good over evil required more than battlefield success. It required the ongoing commitment to repair and growth. Yet, as peace settled like a soft cloak, new questions arose about the meaning of power and the ethical uses of it. Rama's unassuming nature made him wary of any form of rule that exoticized might. He insisted on humility as a watchword of authority and established checks that prevented the concentration of power in corrupt hands. The practice of governance, he believed, must remain reflective and self-critical, for moral vigilance is the guard against complacency. Hanuman's tales continue to circulate in everyday life, not merely as stories of prodigious feats but as parables of devoted service. Children learned of his leaps and his wiles, but elders taught that true devotion is less about spectacle and more about fidelity to a noble purpose. Hanuman himself spent his days not only recounting adventures but also teaching younger followers the discipline of devotion. In his calm presence, the community found a model of courage tethered to humility. The rebuilt roads and restored bridges encouraged trade and brought distant peoples into contact once more, reminding everyone that prosperity is often a communal enterprise. Craftsmen found markets for their work beyond the kingdom's borders, and merchants returned with ideas and goods that enriched the cultural tapestry. Economic revival did not erase the memory of hardship, but it did provide fertile ground for hope and for the practical pleasures that make life worth living. Economic health became a partner in cultural and moral regeneration. As Rama sat in council with ministers and sages, he often reflected on the paradoxes that had accompanied his journey. He had been exiled to learn empathy and to grow beyond the narrow comforts of privilege, and paradoxically, that very hardship had prepared him to govern with more wisdom. To lead well, he had discovered, one must have known both want and plenty, suffering and celebration. This breadth of experience became his most reliable compass in making decisions that affected countless lives. There were also darker lessons learned about the seduction of power and the fragility of moral certainties. The enemies defeated in the war had been formidable not merely because of their force, but because they had been persuasive in their own narratives. Rama understood that vigilance against moral corruption meant constant education and the cultivation of civic virtues. Institutions needed to be built not as fortresses against dissent but as forums for sustained moral engagement. The celebration of victory slowly gave way to a more steady rhythm of governance focused on continuity and service. The king's daily tasks no longer consisted solely of grand proclamations but of attending to the ordinariness of a kingdom's needs. He presided over disputes, he instituted measures to protect the vulnerable, and he encouraged art and learning. These were quieter triumphs than those won on battlefields, but they were no less vital for the health of the realm. Rama's relationship with his subjects matured into one of reciprocal respect. They trusted his judgments, and he trusted their honest reflections and criticisms when he sought them. That two-way trust was the necessary oxygen of a flourishing polity, for a ruler who communes with his people learns to shape law by listening, and subjects who are heard learn to accept rulings with a greater sense of ownership. It is in listening that rulers discover the courage to be merciful, and citizens find the patience to follow. Seasonal festivals returned with renewed meaning as they celebrated not just gods and nature but the resilience of a community that had weathered trials. Music, dance, and poetry became vehicles for communal therapy of a sort, transforming grief into memory and memory into guidance for the future. Artists were celebrated for their role in making shared experience legible, and the arts were encouraged to flourish as civic rituals of education and beauty. Culture, in this restored landscape, became an active force for moral renewal. Rama's crown was no longer only a symbol of victory but a reminder of continual obligation. He wore it lightly and with the recognition that every symbol of authority can be a temptation. His advisors counseled him, and he valued sages who urged caution against pride. The king cultivated the habit of humility as a daily practice, preferring to attribute his successes to the collective effort of his people rather than to singular glory. In that modesty, he modeled a different kind of leadership, one focused on service rather than spectacle. At times, the refreshment of peace allowed for the return of philosophical debate about the nature of good and evil itself. Scholars and poets met beneath pavilions, arguing about destiny and free will, about the duty of kings and the rights of citizens. These discussions were more than intellectual leisure. They formed the ethical backbone of a society seeking to prevent the recurrence of cruelty. Philosophy became a practical tool to refine law and custom in service of a more humane polity. Rama also placed considerable thought into the education of the next generation, because true triumph over evil is measured by how well a society inoculates itself against future injustice. Schools were established where boys and girls alike were taught not simply facts but virtues, generosity, courage, fairness, and self-discipline. Teachers were tasked with making moral imagination as central to education as mathematics or poetry, because a learned populace that is also virtuous is the surest bulwark against tyranny and complacency. The story of the Vanera army and their sacrifices moved into rites of remembrance that were taught to children as both history and moral lesson. Their courage was commemorated alongside the names of those who had fallen, so that bravery would not be romanticized into recklessness but honored as the willingness to protect the common good. The city's memory thus included not only the antics of heroes but also the sober reminders that bravery demands sacrifice and foresight. Those were lessons the elders felt obliged to pass on. Rama's diplomacy reached beyond mere pacts and treaties. He began a program of cultural exchange aimed at knitting a broader peace across the region. Artists and scholars traveled, bringing ideas and stories that softened borders and created shared understandings. Trade routes became conduits for cultural empathy, and slowly the network of relationships grew beyond the old rivalries. In this, Rama showed that the triumph over evil includes creating systems that reduce incentives for violence by expanding mutual dependency. In the temples and courtrooms, debates about justice continued to demand clarity, for victory had not ended the need for ethical discernment. Cases came before the king that challenged the application of mercy versus strictness, and Rama found himself called to interpret the spirit of the law rather than merely its letter. Justice, he discovered, required a heart that could measure both harm and intention, and a willingness to tailor remedies to both punishment and rehabilitation. The work of governance, then, became an art of balancing correction and compassion. Rama took care to protect the marginalized, because the triumph of good is hollow if it fails those with the least power. Measures were introduced to provide relief to widows, to ensure fair wages for laborers, and to keep the marketplace honest. He understood that institutions must be judged by how well they safeguard the vulnerable, for strength without justice merely becomes another form of oppression. The king's conscience was guided by an ethic that kept human dignity at the center of every policy. There were also quiet tensions that simmered in corners, as the memory of the Rakshasa rule could not be entirely contained. Old fears flared in moments of scarcity, and opportunists tried to exploit tensions for personal gain. The administration worked to identify and correct these sources of unrest, using both preventive social programs and judicious law enforcement. The oversight required constant attention, because complacency can be fertile soil for the return of disorder and cruelty. Over time, the story of the war and the return found its way into the rituals of daily life, in prayers and in common sayings. People began to use its phrases to teach patience and resilience, to remind children that duty and courage matter. This embedding of the epic into ordinary language ensured that its lessons would persist not as abstract moralizing but as practical guides for living. The narrative thus transformed into a communal moral grammar that shaped everyday choices. Rama and Sita, who had endured so much together, eventually found a rhythm that harmonized their private love and their public responsibilities. They became partners in governance as well as in life, shaping policies that reflected compassion and fairness. Their relationship, though forever marked by trials, became a living testament to the possibility of reparation and renewed trust. It was this fusion of personal restoration and public service that many citizens found most inspiring about their return. The coronation festivals continued to echo in the memory of the city for years, not as a singular triumph but as the starting point for sustained renewal. The rites had aligned public spirit with the moral work that lay ahead, and that alignment was critical to the kingdom's resilience. Festivals reemerged as moments not only of celebration but also of recommitment to communal standards. In celebrating, the people also reaffirmed their willingness to be governed by principles rather than merely by the whims of power. The children born in the post-war years carried with them a generation's hope and the latent memory of what had been suffered. They were reared in a society that emphasized both courage and compassion, and they learned to see the king not as an unreachable symbol but as an exemplar of service. In these younger faces, the kingdom observed the future taking root, and there was comfort in the sense that new lives would continue the work of guarding against moral erosion. The cycle of renewal had a visible, human face. As time stretched, the triumph of good over evil unfolded less as a single climactic event and more as a continuing practice. Peace was not a one-time declaration but a daily experiment in governance, law, culture, and personal virtue. Rama's era was remembered not simply for its military victory but for its commitment to translate that victory into institutions and habits that would endure. The true measure of triumph, it became clear, lay in prevention and cultivation rather than merely in conquest. In the end, the return of the king was both a literal homecoming and a metaphor for the restoration of moral order. Rama's journey had taken him from palace to forest to battlefield and back, and the arc of his life became a map for others seeking to navigate duty and desire. His triumph was not only over a powerful enemy but over the temptations that authority presents. He modeled a path in which strength serves compassion, and in which victory is measured by the flourishing of ordinary lives. The kingdom settled into a steadier, gentler rhythm as the years went on, and the stories of that great return were told and retold around fires and in halls. Those narratives carried both joy and warning, celebrating what had been reclaimed and reminding listeners of the vigilance required to keep it. People learned that triumph and maintenance are distinct labors. The first wins the day, but the second wins the future. This understanding became the inheritance that Rama and his people offered to coming generations. And so the return of the king remained a living story, not frozen in a single moment of coronation but continuing in the acts of kindness, the fairness of judgments, and the practical care of the needy. The triumph of good over evil, in this telling, was not the demise of all darkness but the determination to build infrastructures, moral, social, economic, that minimize suffering and encourage virtue. It was a lesson in the patient work of reshaping society into a place where righteousness could flourish. The memory of those years carried on as a moral compass for rulers and commoners alike, reminding everyone that the greatest victories are the ones that improve the common life. The tale of Rama's return taught that courage must be paired with humility and that justice must be tempered by mercy. As listeners and readers across time would learn, triumphs are not final seals but invitations to continual renewal. In that way, the return of the king became an evergreen lesson for every age. Rama's story still reminds us what real victory means. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what stays with you more, the courage to fight or the mercy to forgive.